I was 31 years old when I decided I needed a break from my regular life. It was early fall of 2017, and I had been working nonstop in a small tech company in Chicago. The city felt like it was closing in on me. Traffic, noise, people everywhere. It had been months since I had taken a vacation. I wanted something different this time, something far away from crowded tourist spots. I wanted silence, real silence. No car horns, no chatter, no buzzing phones. Just me and nature. After looking around online for a few days, I found a small campground called Pine Hollow Reserve about 3 hours north, tucked deep into the forests of Wisconsin. It wasn't one of those popular places you read about where families bring their RVs and kids run around with glow sticks. No, this place was for real campers, isolated, rugged, not many marked trails, and definitely no cell service. Exactly what I wanted. I packed carefully. My large green backpack was stuffed with a tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, a small hatchet, a hunting knife, basic cooking gear, and about 4 days worth of food. Cans of beans, dried fruit, protein bars, and a few bottles of water. I also had water purification tablets just in case. I tossed in a first aid kit, matches, a flashlight with extra batteries, and a heavy-duty tarp. I knew enough about camping to be careful, but I wasn't exactly a survival expert. I figured common sense would get me through it. The morning I left, it was cool but sunny. I remember feeling excited as I pulled out of the city. With each mile north, the buildings grew fewer and the trees taller. The radio stations faded one by one until it was just me and the hum of the engine. I pulled into the gravel parking lot of Pine Hollow around noon. There were only 2 other cars there, both looking dusty and parked off to the side like they had been there for days. The air was crisp and smelled like pine and wet dirt. I threw my backpack over my shoulders, checked the map at the trailhead, and started walking. I decided not to set up in the designated campgrounds. I wanted to find my own spot, somewhere off-trail, where I wouldn't see anyone for days. I followed the main trail for about an hour, then veered off when I saw a game path winding through the trees. It wasn't an official trail, just a narrow path animals must have made. Perfect. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No planes overhead, no distant sounds of cars. Just wind through the trees and the occasional snap of a twig under my boots. I walked until my legs were starting to burn and the light was beginning to soften, the sun dipping lower. I found a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and thick undergrowth. It felt private and protected. I dropped my pack and started setting up. I pitched my tent near a fallen tree and gathered enough wood to build a small fire. I cooked a can of beans over the flames, sitting on a flat rock as the fire popped and cracked. Darkness fell fast out there. Real darkness, thicker than anything you feel in the city. I sat by the fire for a while, just soaking it all in, then crawled into my tent and zipped it tight. The first night was peaceful. I slept hard, only waking up once or twice when the wind picked up or a branch snapped somewhere out in the dark. Normal forest sounds. I wasn't scared. I actually felt good. I drifted back to sleep easily each time. The second day I explored. I didn't want to get lost, so I marked trees with small strips of orange ribbon as I moved. I hiked further into the woods, climbing over rocks and pushing through thick brush. I found a small creek about a mile from my camp, cold and clear, trickling over stones. I filled up my water bottles there and purified the water carefully before drinking it. Later that afternoon, as I was making my way back to camp, I noticed something odd. A tree, maybe 50 yards off from the path I had made, had deep scratches running down its trunk. Not animal scratches. These were too deep, too straight, like someone had run a large knife or even a machete down the bark over and over. The bark was fresh, peeled back in long, clean strips. I paused for a long time, staring at it. Maybe someone else had camped here before me and marked it for some reason. I didn't know. It made me feel uneasy, but I shrugged it off. Maybe hunters, maybe someone playing around. I moved on. That night, I stayed close to the fire. I noticed how silent the forest had become. I mean, it had been quiet before, but now it was dead silent. No insects buzzing, no owls hooting, just stillness. It made my skin prickle. I went into my tent early, zipped it up tight, and kept my flashlight within easy reach. I woke up sometime after midnight to a sound. A soft, steady crunching. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the undergrowth nearby. Not an animal. I knew that much. I've heard deer before, and they move quick, light on their feet. This was heavier and slower. I lay completely still, barely breathing, ears straining in the darkness. The footsteps circled my tent once, then again. I could hear the faint rustle of clothes brushing against bushes, the soft click of a boot heel against a rock. My heart hammered so loud in my chest I thought whoever it was could hear it. The footsteps eventually faded away into the trees. I stayed frozen for what felt like hours before daring to move. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just lay there, gripping the handle of my knife, listening. When the sky finally began to lighten, I cautiously stepped outside. The fire had burned down to embers. The forest still felt wrong, too quiet. I packed up a day's worth of food and water and decided to hike back to the creek, to put some distance between me and the camp for a while. I needed to think, to clear my head. I moved carefully, checking behind me often. The morning air was cold and damp, and mist clung to the ground. I found the creek and sat on a large stone, chewing a protein bar and trying to figure out what to do next. I didn't want to panic. Maybe it was another camper, someone passing through. Maybe they hadn't even seen my tent. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I stayed by the creek most of the morning. When I finally made my way back to camp, something was wrong. I could feel it before I even saw it. My tent had been slashed open down one side, the material hanging in ragged strips. My gear was scattered. The food bag had been emptied out and tossed aside. Nothing stolen, just ruined. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been walking around my tent last night had come back when I was gone. This wasn't random. Someone was messing with me. I packed up whatever I could salvage in a rush, stuffing things into my backpack with shaking hands. I decided right then and there I was getting out. I wasn't about to stick around to see what would happen next. I didn't even try to find the game path I had come in on. I just picked a direction, back toward where I thought the main trail was, and started moving fast. The forest felt endless, trees stretching out in every direction. I checked the position of the sun to keep my bearings, but every few minutes, I found myself second-guessing. Had I passed that tree before? Was I going in circles? Around mid-afternoon, I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. It was a small pile of rocks carefully stacked, right in the middle of a clearing. On top of the rocks was my orange ribbon, the ones I had used to mark the trees. It had been tied into a tight little knot and placed neatly on top. Someone had been following me, watching where I went, picking up my markers after I passed. I dropped the last of my food to move faster. My legs were cramping, and my throat was dry, but I pushed on. I didn't stop. Every crack of a branch behind me made me whip my head around. Every shadow between the trees looked like a person. The sun was getting lower. I knew if I didn't find the trail before dark, I'd be stuck out there another night, maybe worse. Then, just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I saw something through the trees, the wooden post marking the start of the main trail. Relief hit me like a wave. I practically sprinted the last few yards, crashing through bushes and tripping over roots. I didn't stop running until I saw the parking lot. Both cars were still there, mine and one other. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking so bad I dropped them twice. When I finally got the door open, I threw my pack onto the passenger seat and peeled out of there so fast I sprayed gravel behind me. I didn't stop driving for over an hour. Only when I hit a gas station on the edge of a small town did I finally pull over. I locked the doors, sat there for a long time, just breathing. Looking back, I don't know who was out there with me. Maybe a local who didn't like outsiders. Maybe someone worse. I never went back to Pine Hollow. I never reported it either. What would I have said? That someone scared me? That someone slashed my tent? No one would have cared. Now, years later, whenever someone talks about how peaceful it must be to camp alone, far away from everything, I just nod. I don't tell them about the footsteps in the dark, the slashed tent, or the silent woods. Nature isn't what you have to be afraid of out there. It's the people you can't see. The one I was 28 years old when I decided to take a long weekend off from work and go camping by myself. It was late September 2017, and the air was just starting to cool down in the mountains of Idaho. I had been living in Boise for a few years, working a desk job that kept me cooped up inside for way too many hours. I was feeling burnt out, and I figured a few days alone in the woods would help clear my mind. I wasn't new to camping. Growing up in Vermont, my dad used to take me hiking and camping every summer. I knew how to pack properly, how to make a fire, how to set up camp even if it rained. I wasn't worried. I chose a spot that wasn't too far from the city but far enough to feel like I had left everything behind. It was called Salmonberry Ridge, a place that used to be popular in the 80s and 90s, but now hardly anyone went there. I had found a few mentions of it online, mostly from older forums, saying that the trails were overgrown and the campsites were rough, but I didn't mind. I actually liked the idea of being somewhere forgotten. I left early Friday morning. My old gray Subaru was loaded with everything I could need: my tent, sleeping bag, water, a small cooler with food, a backpack with first aid supplies, maps, compass, flashlight, knife, and a few other essentials. I wasn't planning to camp too far from my car. Maybe a mile or two in, just enough to feel away from everything. The drive was easy at first. Paved roads turned into gravel, and then gravel turned into a dirt road with potholes. I had to slow way down, and at times it felt like my car was going to shake itself apart. After about an hour of bouncing around, I reached what used to be a parking area. There was a faded wooden sign with most of the paint peeled off. I could barely make out the words, Salmonberry Ridge Trailhead. I parked under a scraggly pine tree. The air smelled sharp and clean, and there was that deep silence you only get way out in the wild. No hum of traffic, no voices, not even the sound of planes overhead. Just the whisper of the breeze and the occasional creak of the trees. Felt good. I shouldered my backpack, locked up the car, and started down the trail. The trail was even rougher than I expected. In some places, the weeds and brush had completely taken over, and I had to push through shoulder-high plants. The path was still there if you looked closely, a faint depression in the ground, the way years of footsteps packed down the dirt. I moved slowly, careful to watch my footing. The last thing I needed was to twist an ankle out here. After about an hour of hiking, I found a decent clearing just off the trail. It was flat, surrounded by trees, and close to a little creek that was more of a trickle this time of year. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and got a small fire going. Felt peaceful. The sun filtered down through the trees in golden patches, and the breeze made the leaves whisper and sway. I spent the afternoon exploring a little. I followed the creek upstream for a while, looking at animal tracks in the mud and old fallen logs covered in moss. I found a few rusted old beer cans and a tattered piece of blue tarp caught in a tree, signs that someone had camped here long ago. I felt a little uneasy seeing that tarp fluttering in the breeze, but I told myself it was nothing. People used to come here all the time. It was just leftover junk. As the sun started to sink, I made some dinner. A can of beef stew heated over the fire and sat on a log to eat. The sky turned pink and gold, then deep purple. The forest around me darkened slowly, and the stars started to come out. It was beautiful. I felt the stress of the city melting away. After dinner, I sat by the fire for a while, just listening to the night. I heard owls hooting in the distance and the tiny splash of fish jumping in the creek. Every so often, a branch would crack somewhere out in the woods. That's normal, I reminded myself. Animals moving around. Maybe a deer, maybe a raccoon. Nothing to worry about. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and slid into my sleeping bag. It was chilly, but I had packed warm clothes and a good bag, so I was comfortable. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting a faint red light against the side of the tent. I closed my eyes and listened to the sounds of the night. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, I was waking up in the pitch dark, heart pounding, with no idea what had woken me. I lay still, straining my ears. The forest was silent now. Not just quiet, silent. No owls, no wind, no splash of water. It was as if everything had frozen. I told myself it was probably nothing, just my brain playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a faint, deliberate crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. Not an animal. Animals move differently. They scurry or crash around, noisy and unpredictable. This was slow, careful, like someone trying not to make noise but failing just a little. The footsteps were coming from the direction of the trail, moving toward my camp. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I kept my eyes on the thin red glow of the fire outside the tent. Part of me wanted to sit up, grab my knife, and be ready. Part of me wanted to stay absolutely still and hope whoever it was would just pass by. The footsteps stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Then I heard the soft rustle of fabric, like someone brushing against a bush or tree. Still no sound from the night around me, just my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, maybe 5, maybe 10. Couldn't tell. My mind raced. Was it a hiker who got lost? A hunter? Some crazy person? I thought about calling out, but my gut screamed not to. I stayed still. Eventually, I heard the footsteps again, moving away this time. Slow, careful, deliberate, back toward the trail. I lay there a long time, too scared to move. Gradually, the normal sounds of the forest started to return. The distant hoot of an owl, the sighing of the breeze. I stayed awake until the first gray light of dawn started to filter through the trees. When it was light enough to see, I crawled out of the tent. The fire was completely out. I scanned the trees but saw nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. I packed up quickly. I didn't even make breakfast. I stuffed everything into my backpack, stomped out the last of the embers, and started back down the trail toward my car. The trail seemed different in the morning light, more narrow, more closed in. Every snapped twig and crushed leaf felt like it had a story to tell. I moved fast, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. After about half an hour, I spotted something up ahead, something that hadn't been there when I hiked in. It was a pile of stones, about waist high, stacked carefully right in the middle of the trail. Someone had built it recently. The stones were clean, not covered in moss or dirt. At the base of the pile, stuck into the ground, was a stick with a strip of faded red cloth tied to it. I stared at it for a long time. It wasn't just random. Someone had built it on purpose, and it hadn't been there yesterday. I thought about turning around, but I knew I couldn't go back to the campsite. I had to get to my car. I stepped around the stone pile and kept moving. The closer I got to the trailhead, the more I felt like I was being watched. I kept catching glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye, a flash of brown behind a tree, a shadow slipping out of sight. But whenever I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. My heart was hammering by the time I reached the parking area. My car was still there, dusty and lonely under the pine tree. But something was wrong. The driver's side door was hanging open. I know I had locked it. I always double-checked. I sprinted the last few steps and looked inside. My glove box was open, papers scattered across the seat. My backpack, which I had left with extra supplies, was gone. I didn't waste time. I jumped into the car, slammed the door, and started the engine. The car roared to life, and I tore out of that parking area, bouncing over potholes, scraping branches, not caring about the noise or the damage. I didn't feel safe until I hit the paved road again, miles later. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. When I got home, I called the county sheriff's office. They sent someone out to check the trailhead, but they didn't find anything. No people, no stone piles, no sign of whoever had broken into my car. They took a report and told me it was probably just some drifter or illegal camper. I wanted to believe that, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. Someone had been watching me. They had followed me to my camp. They had gone through my car. Maybe they had built that stone pile as a warning or a message I didn't understand. Whatever it was, it wasn't random. I didn't go camping alone again after that. I still love the outdoors, but now I stick to busy parks, places with other people around. I still think about Salmonberry Ridge sometimes, about the silent forest, the careful footsteps in the night, the pile of stones on the trail, and I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed another night. My name is Adam Marshall. I'm 28 years old, and back in the summer of 2021, I made a decision that I regret to this day. I thought it would be a good idea to take a solo camping trip deep into the mountains of northern Wyoming. I wasn't new to camping or hiking. I had done a lot of weekend trips when I lived in Oregon, but those were mostly in crowded national parks with plenty of other people around. This time, I wanted something different, something way off the beaten path. I had this idea that I could disconnect completely, spend 4 or 5 days out there by myself and just reset my mind. I did some research and found a place called the Bridger Highlands. It wasn't an official campground, just a huge stretch of rugged, forested mountains. From what I read, not many people went that deep into that area. That's what appealed to me. I packed everything carefully. A good tent, sleeping bag, food for 6 days, a portable stove, a solar battery pack, a satellite phone for emergencies, a small hunting knife, and a bear spray canister. I even packed a little first aid kit just in case. I thought I had prepared for everything. I parked my truck at the very end of a dirt service road that was barely wide enough for a vehicle. I locked it up, threw my pack on my back, and started hiking. The trail wasn't official. It was more of a rough game trail that wound up into the forest. Felt good at first. The sun was shining, the air smelled of pine and dirt, and there was no sign of another human being for miles. Exactly what I wanted. The first day went smoothly. I hiked about 6 miles in and found a small clearing near a shallow creek. It was perfect. Flat ground, plenty of space to set up my tent, and just enough tree cover to feel protected without being claustrophobic. I set up camp, cooked some freeze-dried chili, and sat by the creek until it got dark. The sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional splash from the creek were soothing. I crawled into my sleeping bag and slept like a log. The next morning, I decided to explore a little deeper into the woods. I packed a small day pack with water, some food, my knife, and the bear spray, and headed off, marking my trail with small ribbons of orange tape so I wouldn't get lost. I wandered for hours, climbing up rocky ridges and picking my way through thick clusters of trees. I found some deer tracks, a few old bear prints, but otherwise nothing out of the ordinary. Around late afternoon, I headed back to camp. That's when I first noticed it. My camp didn't look right. At first, I thought it was just the light. The sun was getting low, and the shadows made everything look a little off. But as I got closer, I realized my tent had been moved. Not a lot, maybe 2 feet, but it was definitely not in the exact spot where I had set it up. The ground underneath it was disturbed, and the stakes on one side had been pulled out and jammed back into the dirt clumsily. I stood there for a long time just staring at it. A part of me wanted to believe I had just misremembered, but deep down I knew I hadn't. I always take pictures of my campsites for memories, and when I checked my phone, sure enough, the tent had been set up a few feet to the right originally. Someone or something had moved it. I did a slow circle around the clearing, checking for footprints, broken branches, anything. I didn't find anything clear. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a bear sniffing around, but it didn't sit right. A bear wouldn't move a tent like that without tearing it. And none of my stuff was missing. Not the food, not the pack, nothing. I didn't want to panic. I decided to stay calm and alert. I cooked a quick dinner, kept my bear spray and knife within arm's reach, and built a small fire to keep any animals away. I didn't sleep well that night. Every little noise outside made my heart pound. But eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. The next day, I seriously thought about packing up and hiking back to the truck. It would be about a 10-mile hike back downhill, doable but tough. I sat by the creek, sipping instant coffee, weighing my options. In the end, I convinced myself to stay. I didn't want to waste the trip over what could have just been my imagination. I decided to stick closer to camp that day. I fished in the creek a little and gathered some extra firewood. I didn't stray more than a few hundred yards from my tent. As the sun began to set, I built up the fire bigger than usual, feeling a little better with the extra light. I triple-checked that my bear spray and knife were right next to my sleeping bag before crawling in. At around 2 in the morning, I woke up to a sound. It wasn't an animal noise. It was sharp, deliberate, like someone or something had stepped on a branch not far from my tent. I laid there, frozen. My heart was hammering in my chest so hard I could barely hear anything else. I strained my ears. Another crunch. Closer this time. I slowly, very slowly, unzipped the sleeping bag and reached for the bear spray. I didn't make a sound. I sat up, clutching the canister, and stared at the thin nylon wall of the tent. The fire outside had burned down to glowing embers, so the clearing was mostly dark. Another crunch, then silence. I don't know how long I sat there. Felt like hours. Eventually, the forest seemed to settle again. No more footsteps, no more sounds. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. As soon as the sky started to lighten with dawn, I threw everything into my pack as fast as I could. I didn't even bother cooking breakfast. I just wanted out of there. The hike back was brutal. I kept looking over my shoulder the whole way, feeling like I was being watched. My heart didn't stop hammering until I finally saw the glint of my truck through the trees. I practically ran the last 100 yards. But when I got to the truck, my stomach dropped. Someone had slashed the tires. Both rear tires were flat, long, jagged knife cuts across the rubber. I stood there staring at them, feeling completely exposed. There was no way I could drive out like that. The nearest town was over 30 miles away. No cell service. The satellite phone was buried deep in my pack. I backed up against the truck, trying to calm down. I needed a plan. First, I dug out the satellite phone and tried calling for help. The first 2 calls didn't go through. Bad signal, heavy trees overhead. I scrambled up a nearby ridge, trying to get a clearer view of the sky. After what felt like forever, I finally got through to the county sheriff's office. I explained where I was, that my truck was disabled, and that I needed help. The dispatcher's voice was calm, but I could tell she didn't like the sound of the situation. She told me to stay put, keep my satellite phone on, and that a deputy would head out to find me, but it might take several hours. I climbed back down to the truck and tried to find a place to hide. I didn't want to just sit there out in the open. I found a dense thicket of bushes about 50 yards away where I could see the truck without being easily seen myself. I crawled in there with my pack and waited. The hours dragged by. Every little sound set my nerves on edge. A few times I thought I saw movement in the trees, but it could have just been the wind. Finally, just before sunset, I heard the distant rumble of an engine. I peeked out and saw a sheriff's SUV bouncing down the dirt road. I ran out, waving my arms like a madman. The deputy, a tall guy named Officer Nelson, jumped out and sized up the situation fast. He didn't ask many questions, just told me to grab my gear and get in the truck. As we drove away, bumping down that terrible road, he finally spoke. He said they didn't usually patrol that area much, too remote, too rough. But every once in a while, hikers or campers would report strange things. Gear stolen, campsites trashed, even a few people who had gone missing over the years. Nothing they could ever prove, just a bad feeling about the place. I didn't say much. I just stared out the window, feeling the adrenaline finally start to drain out of me. When we got back to town, I bought 2 new tires, got my truck fixed, and drove straight home without stopping. I didn't even bother trying to find another campsite. I just wanted to put as much distance as possible between me and those mountains. I haven't been camping alone since. I think about it sometimes, late at night when everything is quiet. I wonder who was out there, watching me, moving my tent, slashing my tires, stalking around my camp in the middle of the night. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't my imagination. It was a person, a real, breathing person, out there in the middle of nowhere doing God knows what. And the scariest part is, if I hadn't woken up that night, if I hadn't been ready, maybe they would have done more than just watch. Since then, whenever I hear about people wanting to go off-grid, to disconnect, deep in the woods, I just shake my head. I don't tell them not to. Everyone has to learn their own lessons. But me, I stay close to people now. I don't camp alone anymore. And I always listen to that feeling in my gut when it tells me something isn't right. Because out there, where no one can hear you scream, sometimes the worst thing waiting in the dark is another human being. It was early September 2022 when I decided to take a camping trip by myself. I had been working non-stop for months, glued to a desk, staring at computer screens until my head hurt. I needed to get away, clear my mind, and remind myself what real air felt like. I chose Pine Hollow, a forested area in northern Montana, about 4 hours drive from where I lived. I had been there once with my uncle years ago, and I remembered it being quiet, open, and wild, perfect for what I needed. I packed my old Honda Civic with all the basics: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a few extra clothes, my pocket knife, a heavy flashlight, some ropes, a small cooking stove, and a first aid kit. I even threw in a flare gun that had been collecting dust in my closet. I figured I wouldn't need it, but better safe than sorry. I left early in the morning, just before sunrise, to beat the weekend traffic. The drive was long, with stretches of road where I didn't see another car for miles. It was the kind of lonely that you either find comforting or unsettling, depending on your mood. When I finally arrived, I pulled into a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. There was no official campsite, no marked trails, no facilities, just nature. Exactly how I wanted it. I parked the car under the shade of a big tree and started setting up camp. The sun was still climbing the sky, and the air smelled sharp with pine needles and damp earth. After pitching my tent, I set out a folding chair and made a small fire ring with rocks I found nearby. I spent the afternoon gathering wood, checking the area, making sure I knew where everything was, where the stream was for water, where the nearest trail back to the road was, even where I could find dry wood if it rained. That evening, after a simple dinner of canned soup heated over my little stove, I sat by the fire and just listened. No cars, no voices, no hum of electricity, just the crackle of firewood and the distant sounds of birds. I stayed up for a while, just soaking it all in, then crawled into my tent and drifted off to sleep. The first night was uneventful, but sometime around dawn, I woke up to the sound of snapping twigs. It was faint but clear in the silence of the woods. I froze, listening. Could have been an animal, a deer maybe, but my heart was pounding hard anyway. After a few minutes of silence, I told myself it was nothing and managed to fall back asleep. The next day, I decided to explore. I packed a small backpack with water, some snacks, my knife, and a map I had printed out before leaving home. I wandered through the woods, sticking mostly to the game trails, stepping over fallen logs, ducking under low branches. It was beautiful, sunlight streaming through the tall trees, squirrels darting up trunks, birds swooping overhead. After a couple of hours, I stumbled onto an old, overgrown path. It didn't look like a hiking trail, more like something left behind by logging trucks years ago. The ground was uneven, and weeds and young trees were growing through the ruts. Something about it made me curious, so I followed it. After about 20 minutes, I came across something unexpected. A clearing with an old shack. It looked abandoned, the wood gray and warped with age, the door hanging crooked on its hinges. Broken glass littered the ground near the windows, and an old tire swing, its rope frayed and worn, hung from a low branch nearby. I felt a deep unease standing there. The air seemed heavier somehow. I didn't go inside. I just stood there for a minute, then turned and walked back the way I came. I told myself there was nothing weird about it. Probably some old hunting cabin that had been left to rot. Still, I picked up my pace. That night, the unease stayed with me. I kept imagining noises outside my tent. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. I sat by the fire longer than usual, tossing more wood on it than I needed to, just to keep it bright and burning. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I kept the heavy flashlight right beside me, switched on the moment I heard any noise. It must have been around midnight when I heard it. Something moving, just beyond the circle of light from the dying fire. I lay there, breathing as quietly as I could, ears straining. It wasn't the quick, darting movement of a deer or a raccoon. It was slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I gripped the flashlight and clicked it on, aiming it toward the sound. For a split second, I thought I saw something, maybe a person or maybe a tree. But the beam wobbled, and whatever it was disappeared into the shadows. I sat there for a long time, heart hammering, straining to hear if it would come closer. Didn't. Eventually, I convinced myself it had just been my imagination, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found footprints. They were faint, but they were there, pressed into the soft earth not far from my tent. Bigger than mine, heavy. They circled my campsite, weaving in and out of the trees. I stood there staring at them for a long time, my stomach twisted into a tight knot. Someone had been watching me. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but I hesitated. It was broad daylight. Maybe it had been another camper, lost and wandering. Maybe they had just passed through. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I spent that whole day close to camp, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Every sound made me jump. Every flicker of movement in the trees caught my eye. I kept the fire going all day, even though it was warm out, just to have something comforting. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, painting the sky a deep red, I made a decision. I was going to leave first thing in the morning. It wasn't worth it. Whatever peace I had come looking for was gone. I barely slept that night. I stayed zipped inside my sleeping bag, flashlight clutched in one hand, pocket knife in the other. I must have dozed off at some point because the next thing I knew, it was still dark, but there was a noise right outside my tent. A soft, scraping sound, like someone dragging something across the ground. I didn't move. I barely breathed. I listened, my ears straining so hard they hurt. The scraping continued, slow and steady, moving around the tent. I thought about the flare gun in my backpack, just out of reach. I thought about the heavy flashlight by my side. I thought about the knife in my hand. Every instinct screamed at me to stay still. The noise eventually faded, and I lay there until the first light of dawn crept through the thin fabric of the tent. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside, my blood ran cold. There were deep scratches in the dirt all around my tent, like someone had dragged a stick or a branch in looping patterns. In the center of one of the loops was a pile of stones, stacked carefully. A crude, twisted symbol made out of broken sticks was jammed into the top of the pile. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my gear, stuffed it into my backpack without caring about how messy it was, and bolted for the car. I didn't even bother breaking down the tent. I just left it there, flapping in the morning breeze like some ghostly figure waving goodbye. The drive back to the main road felt endless. Every shadow between the trees looked like a figure. Every bump in the road made me jolt. When I finally made it back to the highway and saw other cars again, it felt like I was waking up from a nightmare. I didn't stop driving until I got home, over 6 hours away. I never reported what happened. What would I even say? Someone made creepy drawings in the dirt outside my tent? I didn't have proof, and besides, it was over. I was safe. For weeks afterward, though, I kept looking over my shoulder. Every time I heard a branch snap outside my window or saw a shadow move across the wall, my heart would jump into my throat. I kept the flare gun by my bed. I double-checked the locks every night. Eventually, the fear faded. Life crept back to normal, but I never went camping alone again. And sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep, I think about Pine Hollow, about the footsteps, the strange symbols, the feeling of being watched, and I wonder who or what had been out there with me in the woods, and what would have happened if I had stayed just one more night. I was 27 years old when I decided to take a break from everything and head out for a solo camping trip. It was early September 2019, and I had been feeling burnt out from work and the constant noise of the city. I thought getting away for a few days might help clear my head. I lived in Boise, Idaho at the time, and after doing a bit of research, I found a spot up north called Clearwater National Forest. It looked perfect, remote, thick with trees, a few streams running through it, and plenty of space to set up without running into anyone. I packed up my old Subaru with all the basics: my tent, sleeping bag, a small propane stove, some freeze-dried meals, a first aid kit, my old compass, and a heavy flashlight. I brought a hunting knife too, though I had never used it for anything more serious than cutting rope. I made sure to let my brother know where I was going and how long I'd be gone. Just 3 nights, and then I hit the road. The drive took about 4 hours. As the city faded away, replaced by open fields and thick forests, I felt myself starting to relax. I stopped at a small general store near the edge of the forest to grab a few last-minute supplies. Extra water, some batteries, and a pack of beef jerky. The old man behind the counter gave me a look when I told him where I was heading, but he didn't say anything. I shrugged it off. Maybe he thought I was just another city guy who didn't know what he was doing. I reached the trailhead around noon. There were a couple of old pickup trucks parked there, but I didn't see anyone around. I strapped on my backpack, locked the car, and started hiking. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It had rained the night before, and everything was still wet. The trail was muddy in spots, but the sun was out now, and the weather was supposed to stay clear for the next few days. I hiked for about 2 hours, following the narrow trail deeper into the forest. After a while, I found a good spot to set up, a small clearing near a stream with tall pines circling around it. The ground was fairly dry there, and I had a clear view of the water. I pitched my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and set up a little fire pit. I spent the afternoon gathering dry branches and stacking them nearby, careful not to wander too far from my camp. That first night was peaceful. I boiled some water for a freeze-dried meal, sat by the fire until the stars came out, and then crawled into my sleeping bag. I fell asleep listening to the sound of the stream and the distant hooting of an owl. The next morning, I woke up feeling better than I had in months. The air was crisp and cool. I made a cup of instant coffee, ate a granola bar, and decided to spend the day exploring. I packed a small day bag with water, a map, my compass, and a few snacks, then set off upstream. The trees were so thick in some places that it felt like walking through a tunnel. Every now and then, I'd hear the snap of a twig or the rustle of leaves and assume it was a deer or a rabbit. After a few hours, I realized I had wandered farther than I intended. I checked my compass and the map, but something didn't feel right. The stream had forked at some point, and I must have taken the wrong path. I wasn't too worried yet. I had plenty of daylight left, and I could always follow the water back downstream. Still, as I started heading back, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was the kind of prickly sensation that raises the hairs on the back of your neck. I told myself it was just nerves. Being alone out here could mess with your head. But then I heard it. A sharp crack, like a branch snapping, not too far behind me. I stopped and turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. No movement, no animals darting away. Just silent, still forest. I picked up my pace, trying not to look over my shoulder too much. I told myself it was probably just a deer, maybe a bear. Still, I gripped the handle of my hunting knife tightly as I walked. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was getting low. I set about lighting a fire, trying to focus on normal tasks. The woods around me felt heavier now, as if the trees were leaning closer. I ate dinner quickly, barely tasting it, and kept the fire going as long as I could. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left my knife beside me. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound outside made my heart race. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but part of me didn't believe it. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, slow, careful footsteps, moving just outside my tent. My whole body went rigid. I strained to listen. Whoever it was moved quietly, circling the tent once, maybe twice, before fading back into the woods. I waited a long time before daring to move. My flashlight was within reach, but I was afraid to turn it on, afraid it would show whoever was out there exactly where I was. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I dozed off for a few hours. When morning came, I found footprints in the soft dirt around my tent. Human footprints, not boot prints either, barefoot. The toes and the arch were clear as day. They circled the tent and then disappeared into the trees. I wanted to pack up and leave right then and there, but the thought of hiking back alone, knowing someone was out there, made my stomach turn. What if they were watching me, waiting for me to let my guard down? I decided to stay one more night, but I kept my knife on me and moved my tent closer to the stream. where the open space would give me a better view of anything approaching. That day, I stayed close to camp, gathering more firewood and stacking it high. I even built a few makeshift alarm traps, strings of empty cans tied around the perimeter, hoping the noise would wake me if anything came too close. I barely ate. I kept scanning the tree line, jumping at every little sound. As the sun dipped low, the fear in my gut grew worse. I sat by the fire with my back to the stream, watching the woods. The night crept in slowly, shadows deepening between the trees. The fire crackled and popped, and every noise beyond its light seemed louder, closer. Sometime around midnight, one of the traps went off, a clatter of cans from the left side of camp. I leapt up, knife in hand, and swung the flashlight toward the sound. Nothing, just the cans swinging back and forth in the faint breeze. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat with my back against a tree, watching the fire burn low. I must have dozed off around dawn, because I woke with a start to the sound of splashing water. I snapped my head up and looked around. For a few seconds, everything was quiet. Then I saw him. Across the stream, maybe 30 feet away, a man stood half hidden behind a tree. He was thin, dirty, and naked. His skin was pale, his hair wild and matted. He just stood there, staring at me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. After what felt like an eternity, he turned and melted back into the forest. That was it. I packed up in record time, throwing everything into my backpack, not even bothering to fold the tent properly. I put out the fire and started hiking back toward the trailhead, moving as fast as I could without completely losing my sense of direction. The hike back was a blur. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I thought I saw glimpses of movement, flashes of pale skin between the trees. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. I just kept moving, following the stream until I found the main trail again. By the time I stumbled back to the trailhead, it was late afternoon. My car was still there, untouched. I threw my gear into the back, locked the doors, and peeled out of there so fast I almost fishtailed. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station about an hour away. Only then did I feel safe enough to get out and breathe. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the pump. I never called the police. I don't know why. Maybe because I thought they wouldn't believe me, or maybe because I just wanted to forget it had ever happened. I told my brother that the trip was fine, a little boring even. I threw out the camping gear a few weeks later. I couldn't even stand to look at it. To this day, I don't know what that man wanted, or how long he had been watching me. Maybe he was just some hermit living out there. Maybe he was dangerous. I don't like to think about it. I haven't been camping alone since, and I don't think I ever will again. Some places just aren't meant to be visited alone. Some places, once you see them for what they really are, never let you forget. I was 29 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the mountains near Durango, Colorado. It was early October 2017, and the weather was just starting to cool down, but the days were still warm enough to make camping comfortable. I had been working a desk job for the past 5 years, and life had started to feel like it was passing me by. I needed something different, something quiet and disconnected from everything. So, when my 2 weeks of vacation came around, I packed my old Ford Ranger with my camping gear and headed out early on a Thursday morning. The drive was long, about 6 hours, but peaceful. I listened to the soft hum of the engine and watched the landscape change from open plains to rolling hills and finally to dense forests and towering mountains. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the trailhead, the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. The plan was simple. Hike about 5 miles into the forest, set up camp near a small river I had read about online, and stay out there for 3 nights. No phone, no laptop, no noise. Just me and the trees. I parked the truck at a small, empty parking area, locked it up, threw my backpack over my shoulders, and started down the trail. The first mile or so was easy, just a gentle slope downhill. The trees were thick, tall pines mixed with yellowing aspens, and the forest floor was soft with old needles and leaves. I could hear the river faintly in the distance, a steady, calming noise that kept me moving forward. As I got deeper into the woods, I started to notice how incredibly quiet it was. Even though it was fall, I had expected to hear birds or maybe the occasional scurry of a squirrel, but there was almost nothing. Just the crunch of my boots on the trail and the distant sound of water. I figured it was just the time of year. Maybe most of the animals had already moved to lower elevations for the winter. By the time I reached the river, the sun was almost gone, and a thin mist was starting to rise off the water. I found a small clearing about 20 yards from the riverbank and set up my tent. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small 2-person tent I had bought years ago for a different trip. I laid out my sleeping bag, set up a little camp stove to boil some water, and made myself a quick dinner of instant noodles. Sitting there on a flat rock, eating with a cheap plastic fork, I felt more relaxed than I had in years. After cleaning up and storing my food away from the tent, always important in bear country, I crawled into my sleeping bag and listened to the river while I drifted off to sleep. The first night was uneventful. I woke up a few times to adjust my sleeping position or because I heard a twig snap outside, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was just normal forest sounds. The next day, I spent the morning exploring the area. I followed the river upstream for about a mile, took some pictures on a small camera I had brought along, and even found an old, broken-down cabin hidden in the trees. It looked like it had been abandoned decades ago. The roof was caved in, and the walls were leaning at odd angles. There were rusted tools scattered around the property, and a collapsed fire pit full of old, blackened stones. I didn't go inside, something about it felt wrong, but I did stand there for a while, imagining who might have lived there and what had happened to make them leave. By early afternoon, the sky started to cloud over, and a chill crept into the air. I headed back to camp, gathered some firewood, and built a small fire to keep warm. As I sat there feeding sticks into the flames, I noticed something strange. Across the river, maybe 50 yards away, there was a tree with strange markings carved into the bark. From a distance, they looked almost like tally marks, long vertical scratches grouped in sets of 5. I figured it was probably just an old trail marker or maybe something left by hunters, but it still gave me an uneasy feeling. I spent the rest of the day close to camp, cooking, reading, and trying to shake off the weird vibe. As the sun set, the mist came back thicker than the night before, swirling low over the ground and making the forest look almost dreamlike. I banked the fire low, climbed into my tent, and tried to get some sleep. That night, I woke up around 2 in the morning, heart pounding in my chest. Something had snapped loudly just outside the tent. Not a twig. This was louder, like a branch being broken in half. I stayed completely still, listening, my mouth dry and my hands sweating. I could hear something moving out there. Slow, heavy steps, not the quick, light movements of a deer or a small animal. Whatever it was big. I lay there for what felt like hours, barely breathing. Eventually, the steps faded away, and I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The mist was thicker than ever, and the world outside the tent was cold and gray. When I finally got the courage to unzip the tent and step outside, I saw that something or someone had been through my camp. The fire pit had been disturbed, the rocks knocked aside. My backpack, which I had left under a tree, was open, and some of the contents were spilled out onto the ground. My food bag was still hanging from a high branch, untouched, but everything else looked like it had been rifled through by someone who was in a hurry or just didn't care about making a mess. The worst part was the footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were boots, heavy, worn boots, and they circled my tent twice before heading back toward the river. I should have packed up and left right then, but I convinced myself it was probably just some other camper or a hunter who had gotten lost and stumbled onto my camp. I didn't want to believe that someone had been creeping around my tent in the middle of the night. I spent the day staying close to the river, keeping the campfire going, and making sure I had my survival knife on me at all times. I didn't go far and I didn't explore. I just stayed alert. That night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed louder. Every gust of wind through the trees made my heart jump. Around midnight, I heard it again, the heavy footsteps. This time, they didn't circle the tent. They stopped about 15 feet away. I could hear breathing, heavy, labored breathing, like someone was standing there, just watching. I didn't move. I didn't even open my eyes. I just lay there, frozen, until the breathing eventually faded and the forest went silent again. When the first gray light of morning broke, I packed up my camp as fast as I could. I didn't even bother making breakfast. I stuffed everything into my backpack haphazardly, tore down the tent, and started back down the trail toward my truck. The trail seemed longer this time. Every creak of the trees and every rustle of the underbrush made me whip my head around. I didn't see anyone, but I felt like I was being watched the entire time. When I finally made it back to the parking area, I almost cried with relief. My truck was still there, undisturbed. I threw my gear into the bed, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors before starting the engine. As I pulled out onto the dirt road, I glanced into the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of something standing just at the edge of the trees. A figure, tall and unmoving, half hidden by the mist. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I kept driving until I hit the highway and didn't look back. I never did figure out who or what had been out there with me. Maybe it was a hunter who got too curious. Maybe it was someone living off the grid who didn't appreciate me camping so close to their territory. Maybe it was something worse, someone who didn't want to be found. I'll never know. After that trip, I didn't camp alone anymore. I still loved the outdoors, still craved that quiet, disconnected feeling, but I made sure to bring a friend or two along from then on. I learned a hard lesson out there. The forest is beautiful, but it's also wild, unpredictable, and not always empty. Some dangers are human. Some dangers don't growl or snap twigs. They breathe heavily in the dark and watch from just beyond the light. In the end, I was lucky. Lucky that whatever was out there didn't decide to do more than just watch. Lucky that I got out without a real confrontation. Lucky that all I lost was some sleep and a little bit of my peace of mind. I still think about it sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet and the world outside my window is dark and still. I remind myself how small we really are when we step into the wild, how easily we can disappear, and how sometimes the scariest thing you can find in the forest isn't a bear or a mountain lion. It's another person. I never thought a simple weekend camping trip could turn into something that would stick with me for the rest of my life. I'm 31 now, but back when this happened, I had just turned 24. It was late September 2017, and the first real cold winds had started sweeping down into northern Idaho. I was living in a small town called Sandpoint, working random construction jobs, and spending my free time either fishing or hiking. I didn't have a big circle of friends. Most of the time, I preferred being alone anyway. That weekend, I decided to head out to an area I hadn't explored much before. It was about an hour and a half drive northeast of town, deep into a part of the Panhandle National Forest that wasn't very popular. I had looked at some maps and found a small, barely marked trail called the Beckett Creek Trail. It wasn't even listed on most of the online hiking sites, which was perfect for me. I didn't want to deal with loud campers or people blasting music out of their trucks. I wanted silence, just me, the trees, and the cold air. I packed up Friday night, a small one-man tent, my old heavy-duty sleeping bag, some trail mix, jerky, a few cans of soup, a Jetboil stove, my fixed-blade knife, a headlamp, extra socks, and my little stainless steel canteen. I threw everything into my hiking backpack, along with a basic first aid kit. My phone barely had reception in town, so I knew it would be dead weight out there, but I packed it anyway and put it on airplane mode to save battery just in case. I set off early Saturday morning, just as the sun was starting to rise. The drive was quiet. I had my windows down even though it was freezing. I liked feeling the cold bite into my skin. It made me feel awake, alive. The further I drove, the more the paved road narrowed, eventually turning into a rough dirt road that snaked up into the hills. Tall pines closed in around me. Frost still clung to the grass in the shadows. I finally found the trailhead around 8:15 a.m. There was no parking lot, just a thin turnout on the side of the road where a couple of old tire tracks cut through the weeds. No signs, no other cars. Perfect. I grabbed my pack, tightened the straps, and started walking. The trail wasn't much of a trail. It looked more like a game path, narrow and uneven, winding between trees and over roots and rocks. It felt like nobody had come this way in years. Every now and then I had to stop and move aside fallen branches or hop over a thick root that had clawed its way up through the dirt. The forest was dead quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing but the soft crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. I kept walking, letting my mind drift, breathing in the sharp, pine-heavy air. After about an hour, the trail dipped down into a gully where a narrow creek trickled through. Beckett Creek, I guessed. The water was clear and icy, running over smooth rocks. I filled up my canteen, took a few sips, and kept going. By midday, I was deep into the woods. The trees had gotten thicker, taller, and the ground was littered with fallen needles that muffled my footsteps. The sun was high, but it barely filtered through the thick canopy. I hadn't seen a single other person all morning, which made me feel even better. Out here, I could pretend the world didn't exist. Around 2:30 p.m., I found a small clearing set back from the trail, just big enough for my tent. It was surrounded on three sides by tall spruce trees, and the ground was relatively flat. I decided it was a good spot to set up camp. I dropped my pack, stretched out my back, and got to work. Setting up the tent only took a few minutes. I gathered some dry twigs and fallen branches for a small fire, clearing a safe spot down to the bare dirt. Even though the fire wasn't really necessary, I had my Jetboil. It was more for comfort. There's something about having a fire that makes you feel a little less alone out there. As the sun dipped lower, the temperature started to fall fast. I bundled up in my jacket and hat, lit the fire, and heated up a can of soup. I ate slowly, savoring the warmth spreading through my body. The woods stayed deathly quiet. It wasn't until the last bit of sunlight started fading that I realized how truly isolated I was. I hadn't even seen any animals. Not a deer, not a rabbit, not even birds. It felt off, but I shrugged it off. Maybe the cold had driven everything into hiding. By 8 p.m., it was pitch black. The stars overhead were sharp and cold, the Milky Way cutting a clear path across the sky. I let the fire burn down low, crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and turned off my headlamp. I lay there for a long time, listening. The woods weren't silent anymore. Somewhere deep in the trees, I could hear faint noises, rustling, snapping branches. At first, I told myself it was just the normal sounds of the forest settling after dark. But the more I listened, the more it sounded like footsteps. Heavy, slow footsteps. I tightened my grip on the knife tucked into the side pocket of my sleeping bag. The sounds moved around the edges of the clearing, never coming closer, but never fully going away either. I didn't dare move. I just lay there, listening, heart hammering in my chest. Eventually, the sounds faded away. I must have fallen asleep sometime after that because the next thing I knew, it was morning. Pale gray light was leaking into the tent, and everything was coated in a thin sheen of frost. I crawled out of the tent, my muscles stiff and cold. The fire had gone out completely. I stood there for a moment, stretching, listening. Nothing, just the wind moving through the trees. I checked around the clearing, looking for signs of animals or something else, but there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no signs that anything had been there. I tried to shake off the unease that had settled in my gut. Maybe I just imagined the sounds last night. Maybe the cold and the isolation had messed with my head. I ate a quick breakfast of trail mix and jerky, packed up my gear, and decided to keep hiking. I didn't want to head back to the car just yet. I still had another night out here, and I figured if I kept moving, I could put some distance between myself and whatever weirdness had happened at that clearing. The trail got even rougher as I moved deeper into the forest. In some places, it disappeared completely, and I had to rely on my compass and map to keep my bearings. The trees grew denser, the ground got muddier near the creek, and in some places, I had to wade through knee-deep water where the trail had been completely swallowed up. By late afternoon, I found another potential campsite. It wasn't as nice as the first. The ground was lumpier, and there were more dead branches overhead, but I was tired and ready to stop. I set up the tent quickly, started another small fire, and huddled close to it, trying to shake off the cold that had seeped into my bones. As the sun went down, I felt that same unease creeping back in. The woods felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, makes you feel like you're underwater. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees, my skin crawling even though I didn't see anything. That night, I barely slept. The sounds started up again not long after I lay down. Only this time, they were louder, closer, definite footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the frosted undergrowth. They circled the tent, moving slowly, pausing now and then as if whoever or whatever it was listening for me. I lay completely still, hardly daring to breathe. My knife was clutched in my hand under the sleeping bag. I strained my ears, trying to figure out what was out there. The footsteps would stop for long stretches, then start again, moving closer, then farther away. Hours seemed to drag by like that. I never heard voices, never heard the unmistakable sounds of an animal, like grunting or sniffing, just footsteps, slow, deliberate. At one point, something brushed against the side of the tent, just a light, dragging touch, like fingers or claws raking across the nylon. I nearly jumped out of my skin, but I stayed still. I didn't dare move, didn't dare turn on my headlamp and give away my exact location inside the tent. Eventually, as the first pale hints of dawn started to creep into the sky, the sounds faded away. When I finally crawled out of the tent, my heart sank. Footprints, dozens of them crisscrossing the area around the tent. They weren't animal prints. They were human, barefoot, but large, wider, and longer than any normal person's foot should be. Some of the toes were splayed out at odd angles. Others looked like they were missing entirely. I felt a wave of cold dread wash over me. I needed to get out of there, fast. I packed up in record time, barely bothering to roll up the tent properly, just shoving everything into my pack. I didn't even eat. I just grabbed my gear and started back the way I'd come. The trail was harder to find now. Either I had wandered off it in my panic the night before or something else had shifted in the forest. I kept moving, checking the compass, trying to stay heading west toward where I had parked the car. But the forest didn't seem right anymore. The trees seemed thicker. The ground seemed I decided to take a break from everything that was weighing me down. It was early September of 2022, and life back in Houston had been dragging me into a hole I couldn't seem to climb out of. Work stress, personal struggles, the city noise. It all felt heavier than usual. I figured a solo camping trip might clear my head. Something away from people, away from my phone, just me in the woods. I chose a spot about 3 hours north, near a place called Riverbend National Forest in Oklahoma. It wasn't a famous place, which made it perfect for me. I didn't want busy campsites filled with RVs and kids running around. I wanted isolation. The forest was dense, filled with endless rows of pine, oak, and hickory trees, and the few reviews I'd found online said the trails were unmaintained but beautiful. That was exactly what I wanted, raw, untamed nature. I packed up my old Toyota Tacoma with the basics, tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, extra clothes, a map of the area, and a heavy-duty flashlight. I even brought a small first aid kit and a can of bear spray, though the odds of running into anything dangerous were pretty slim. I left early on a Thursday morning, thinking if I gave myself 4 or 5 days, I could come back by Monday refreshed. The drive up was smooth. As I left the main highway and took the smaller roads leading toward the forest, I could feel the tension in my chest start to loosen. The air looked cleaner somehow, and the sun shone a little softer through the thick trees. I passed only a handful of small towns, most of them looking half abandoned with rusting gas stations and empty diners. It made the whole thing feel even more remote, which I liked. When I reached the forest entrance, there was no big sign or welcome center. Just a small wooden board with a faded map nailed to it and a gravel path cutting into the trees. It felt like stepping into another world. I drove a few miles down the gravel until I found a small clearing just off a bend in the road. The ground was level and a little stream ran about 50 yards away. It was perfect. I set up my tent close to the tree line but left enough open space around me that I could see in every direction. I got a small fire going and cooked some canned soup, sitting by the flames while the sun dipped low. The forest started coming alive around dusk. I could hear the high-pitched hum of insects, the distant hoots of owls, and the occasional rustle of something small moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful but also a little unnerving. I wasn't used to this kind of silence, not the kind where you expect some background noise, but the kind where the smallest twig snap seems 10 times louder than it should be. That first night, I slept surprisingly well. The cool air wrapped around me inside the tent, and the steady chirp of crickets outside was oddly comforting. I woke up around dawn to the pale gray light filling the woods. The air was crisp, and a thin mist floated low over the ground. It was beautiful. I decided I'd spend the day hiking deeper into the forest, just exploring with no real destination in mind. After a quick breakfast of trail mix and coffee boiled over my little portable stove, I packed a small day bag, water bottle, a granola bar, map, compass, and a knife clipped to my belt and set off. I followed the stream at first, figuring it would be easy to navigate back by just keeping it in sight. The woods were dense, thicker than any place I'd been before. Even a few steps off the stream, and the trees started to close in, the canopy blotting out much of the sky. About an hour into the hike, I found an old, overgrown trail. It wasn't marked, and I doubted it had been used in years, but the ground was still a little worn in some places, a subtle hint of past travelers. I followed it out of curiosity. It twisted and turned, climbing gently uphill. Every so often, I'd spot an old tree blaze, faded paint marks on trunks, barely visible anymore. It felt like stepping into forgotten land, untouched and heavy with silence. As the morning stretched on, I started feeling like I wasn't as alone as I thought. It wasn't anything obvious, not at first, just small things. The way a branch seemed freshly broken, the way the underbrush looked disturbed in places, like someone had passed through recently. At one point, I found what looked like an old campsite, just a rusted metal frame of a chair and a crumpled tarp half buried in leaves. It looked abandoned for years, but something about it put me on edge. I kept moving, telling myself it was nothing, just animals, just the forest playing tricks on me. But a little after noon, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps. Not an animal crashing through the brush, but the steady crunch of boots on dry leaves. They were close, maybe 30 or 40 yards behind me. But when I turned, I saw nothing. I stood frozen for a long minute, straining my ears, but the sounds had stopped. I told myself again it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe a tree limb falling. Anything but another person. Still, I decided it was time to head back. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was suddenly very aware of how isolated I was. I backtracked carefully, trying to follow the same path I had taken earlier. It should have been easy, just follow the stream, but after 20 minutes of walking, I realized I had lost it. The trees all looked the same now, and the subtle sounds of the water had faded. I took out my compass and tried to orient myself. If I just kept moving west, I figured I'd hit the road eventually. I picked a direction and pushed through the dense forest. The ground grew steeper and the trees thicker. I started sweating heavily even though the air was cool. My legs ached from the constant uphill climb, and my stomach growled, reminding me I hadn't eaten since early morning. After another hour or so, I stumbled into a small clearing. It looked unnatural somehow. The grass was trampled down in wide patches, and in the middle was a crude fire pit surrounded by logs. The fire was out, but the ashes were still warm. Someone had been here, recently. I crouched low, scanning the tree line, my heart pounding in my ears. I saw no movement, no sign of anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the way the hair on my arms stood up without warning. I backed away slowly, careful not to make too much noise, and slipped back into the woods. I moved faster now, no longer caring about noise, just wanting to put distance between me and whoever had been there. It was starting to get dark by the time I finally heard the faint rush of the stream again. Relief flooded through me, and I hurried toward the sound. Following the water downstream, I finally recognized a bend in the stream near my camp. I almost cried when I saw the familiar outline of my tent through the trees. When I reached the campsite, everything looked the same, except for one thing. The firewood I had stacked neatly the night before was scattered around, like someone had kicked through it. I hadn't left it like that. I was sure of it. I didn't waste time wondering. I packed up fast, jamming everything into my backpack without care. I knew it was risky traveling at dusk, but staying there felt worse. I decided to hike back to the truck and sleep in it if I had to. The walk back to the road was brutal. The forest was a different world in the fading light. Shadows stretched long between the trees, and every sound felt magnified. The snap of twigs, the distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of leaves in the breeze. I kept spinning around, convinced I would see someone following me, but there was never anything there. It took almost 2 hours to reach the gravel road. By then it was fully dark, and I used my flashlight sparingly, worried the beam would give away my location if someone really was out there. My truck sat where I left it, alone and silent under the black sky. I climbed inside, locked the doors, and just sat there for a long while, trying to catch my breath. I should have driven away immediately, but exhaustion weighed me down. I figured I'd just rest for an hour or two, then drive home at first light. I reclined the seat, kept my knife close, and tried to close my eyes. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching. Someone or something was walking near the truck. I held my breath, heart hammering so loud it hurt my ears. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. The footsteps circled the truck slowly, deliberately. I couldn't see anything outside. The windows were fogged slightly from my breath. The steps stopped right outside my window. I could feel someone standing there, just inches away, separated only by thin glass and metal. I squeezed the knife tighter, ready for anything. Minutes passed, long, painful minutes, before the footsteps finally moved away, fading into the trees. I didn't move until dawn. I sat there, muscles cramped, body aching, too afraid to even lift my head. As soon as the first light touched the trees, I started the engine and peeled out of there, the tires spraying gravel behind me. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. Even then, I kept checking my rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally made it home, the relief was overwhelming. I stepped inside. It was the summer of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the woods near a place called Pine Ridge, a small, remote area in the mountains of New Hampshire. I was 26 years old at the time and had been an avid outdoorsman for as long as I could remember. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for the night I spent alone in those woods. I had been planning the trip for months. I wanted to disconnect from the usual noise of city life, get away from work, and spend some time reflecting on everything that had been happening in my life recently. The idea of spending days alone in the wilderness, hiking, and camping was exhilarating to me. Pine Ridge, despite being a bit out of the way, seemed like the perfect spot. It was quiet, not too many people around, and the kind of place where I could truly immerse myself in nature. I packed my gear carefully: a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, food for a week, a water purifier, a small stove, and of course, a good knife. I had the usual essentials: flashlight, fire starters, and a first aid kit, but something told me I might not need them. I was prepared for anything, or so I thought. The hike to the campsite was easy enough. It was a 6-mile trek through dense forest, with the trail winding through towering trees and over small streams. The air was fresh, the only sounds being the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. I remember thinking to myself that this was exactly what I needed: peace and solitude. I arrived at the campsite by early afternoon, a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. It was perfect. I set up my tent, got a small fire going, and started boiling water for coffee. The sun was still high, and the temperature was pleasant, with a slight chill in the air that hinted at the coolness of the coming night. I spent the next few hours exploring the area, walking along the creek that ran nearby, and checking out the surrounding woods. It was incredibly quiet, not a sound except for my footsteps and the occasional bird. That evening, as the sun began to dip behind the horizon. I sat by the fire, eating some of the jerky and nuts I had brought along. The flames crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows across the clearing. The stars were just starting to appear, the sky a deep shade of indigo. As night fell, the temperature dropped. I retreated into my tent, zipped it up, and settled into my sleeping bag. The fire was now a small glow, barely visible from where I lay. I pulled my jacket tightly around me, grateful for the warmth it provided. My mind wandered, and I thought about how peaceful it was here, how everything seemed so far removed from the hustle and bustle of daily life. I fell asleep quickly, lulled by the sound of the crackling fire and the rustling of leaves in the wind. But I woke up with a start in the middle of the night. It wasn't the sound of an animal or the usual noises of the forest that woke me. It was an eerie, unnatural stillness. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of the forest had vanished completely. No birds, no rustling of leaves, not even the distant sound of an animal moving through the underbrush. Just silence. I lay there, frozen, listening intently. It wasn't normal. Something felt off. I looked around the inside of my tent, my eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. Everything seemed fine, nothing out of place. The fire outside had long since burned out, leaving only a faint smell of smoke in the air. I could hear the faint sound of my breath, but nothing else. My instincts told me to check the area around the tent. I was a seasoned camper, but this silence was unsettling. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously unzipped the door, peeking out. The clearing was bathed in moonlight, casting long shadows across the ground. The trees around me stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the night breeze. Everything appeared normal, but something wasn't right. I could feel it. I stepped outside and walked around the perimeter of my tent, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. There was no movement, no sound, just silence. But as I turned around to head back toward my tent, I saw something that made my blood run cold. At the edge of the clearing, barely visible through the trees, was a figure. It was standing still, barely moving, just watching me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't react. It was just there, in the shadows, almost blending in with the night. I thought it might be another camper, but something about it didn't feel right. I've been in the woods enough to know that people don't just stand still in the dark like that. They make noise, they move, they rustle the leaves or snap a branch underfoot. This figure was completely still. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was a hiker, but that didn't make sense. It was too late for anyone to be out here. After what felt like an eternity, the figure slowly stepped back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there, frozen, for several more minutes, unsure whether to stay outside or retreat back into the safety of my tent. Eventually, I made my decision. I quickly re-entered the tent, zipped it up tightly, and lay down, my heart still racing. I didn't sleep much after that. Every creak of the tent, every rustle of the trees made me jump. I kept my flashlight within arm's reach, though I didn't want to use it again. I didn't want to see whatever that thing was again. Morning came slowly, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. The night had felt like it would never end. I could still feel the tension in the air, but the forest seemed normal again. The birds were chirping, the wind had picked up, and the silence from the previous night was gone. I spent the rest of the day hiking, trying to shake off the fear from the night before. I avoided the area where I had seen the figure, sticking to the other side of the clearing. I kept my mind busy, focusing on the sounds of the forest, the feel of the dirt beneath my boots, and the beauty of the mountains around me. That night, I kept my campfire burning late into the evening, hoping the warmth and light would make me feel safer. But as the darkness fell once again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew deep down that something wasn't right. The feeling that I was not alone persisted. The next morning, I packed up and left early, heading back down the trail towards civilization. I didn't feel any safer, but I knew that staying another night wouldn't help. Something about that place felt wrong, like it was hiding something. I've been back to Pine Ridge since that trip, but I never camped alone again. I still don't know who or what that figure was, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in the dead of night. Some things don't need to be explained, they just need to be avoided. It was late October when I decided to head out for a camping trip on my own. I'd been craving some solitude for a while, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity to disconnect from everything. My friends were always busy, and I didn't mind being by myself in nature. The place I chose was a remote spot in the Kootenay National Park, a rugged and mostly untouched part of Canada. The park was known for its towering cliffs, crystal-clear rivers, and thick forests. An ideal spot for someone like me who loved both nature and peace. I set off from my small apartment in the city in the early morning, the cold air biting my face as I drove along the highway, passing empty stretches of land and endless forests. I was 28, in good shape, and had spent my fair share of weekends hiking and camping, so I felt confident in my abilities to handle whatever the wilderness had to offer. As I arrived at the park entrance, the parking lot was nearly empty. I was the only one there. That gave me a sense of satisfaction. No crowds, no noise, just me and nature. After unloading my gear, tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, I set up camp near the edge of a quiet river, the sound of water gently flowing over rocks. It was the kind of peace you can only get when you're completely alone. As the sun began to set, I made a fire and prepared my meal. The sky turned dark faster than I expected, and soon the air grew colder. Despite the chill, I felt cozy beside the fire, watching the flames dance. As the night deepened, the forest came alive with the sounds of owls hooting, leaves rustling, and distant branches creaking. There was something oddly comforting about the way nature sounded. Everything was alive, even in the dark. I wasn't scared, at least not at first. By around 10 p.m., the fire had died down to embers, and I decided to turn in for the night. I zipped up my tent, crawled into my sleeping bag, and lay there, listening to the quiet of the night. But then I heard it, a soft rustling sound outside the tent. I figured it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. They'd probably smell the food scraps, but I wasn't worried. I had stored everything properly, away from the tent, and had hung the food high in a tree as a precaution. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. I lay there, frozen, listening closely. The rustling came again. It wasn't the usual small sounds of animals. This was heavier, thicker, more deliberate. My heart rate quickened. I tried to convince myself it was just a larger animal like a bear or moose passing by, but the noise sounded too close. It was like something or someone was moving around the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the opening, holding my breath. There was nothing there, just darkness. The trees outside swayed gently in the wind. The noise had stopped. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun had barely crested over the mountains, casting long shadows across the camp. I packed up my tent quickly, still uneasy about the previous night. Everything seemed normal, aside from that strange rustling sound. I shrugged it off, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. I spent the day hiking through the park, taking in the crisp mountain air and the breathtaking views of the valleys below. But my mind kept drifting back to the rustling. It wasn't just the noise itself that bothered me. It was the feeling of being watched. I couldn't shake the thought that someone, or something, had been near my camp the night before. That evening, I set up camp at a different spot, a little farther from the river. I felt more exposed here, but I figured the change of location might help clear my head. The fire crackled as I cooked my meal, the glow casting dancing shadows around the camp. Again, the sounds of the forest filled the air, some comforting, some unsettling. Night fell, and as I lay in my sleeping bag, the same sense of unease crept over me. The rustling came again, much fainter than the night before, but it was there. I sat up, my heart pounding, flashlight in hand. The sound was closer this time, but there was no sign of anything outside. I didn't dare step out of the tent. What if it was a person? What if it was a bear? I stayed awake the entire night, straining to hear any movement. Nothing came. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I decided to break camp and head out. The fear of being watched, of something lurking in the dark, was too much for me. As I packed my things, I made sure to double-check my surroundings. No rustling, no movement. It all seemed peaceful, like it should be. I didn't stick around. I hiked out of the park in a hurry, the whole time feeling like I was being followed. Every rustle in the leaves, every bird call, felt like a warning. When I finally reached the park's entrance, I breathed a sigh of relief. That was 5 days ago. As I sit here writing this, I'm still not sure what happened out there. I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but I can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there with me. The rustling, the constant sense of being watched, felt real, and it felt deliberate. I don't think I'll go back to Kootenai anytime soon. Maybe one day, when the memory fades, I'll give it another shot. But for now, I'm content to stick to more populated trails. I never expected to feel so vulnerable out there. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unforgiving. And I've learned the hard way that sometimes nature holds its secrets a little too close to the chest. I never thought a simple solo camping trip could turn into one of the worst experiences of my life. It happened a few years ago, in late September 2019. I was 28 at the time, and I had just taken a week off from my job at a small marketing firm in Milwaukee. I wanted a break from the constant noise of the city, the endless emails, the honking cars, the fake smiles from coworkers. I wanted real silence, the kind you can only find out there in the wild. I had been looking at maps for a few weeks, searching for somewhere a little more remote, but not too dangerous. I finally decided on the Ottawa National Forest in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. It was big, wild, and not as crowded as other parks. I figured I would hike about 10 miles into the forest, away from any designated camping areas, and set up my own little camp next to a small lake I saw on the map, Lake Moraine. It looked quiet, hidden, perfect. I spent 2 days preparing. I bought extra batteries, new hiking boots, a good knife, a first aid kit, and enough dehydrated food to last 5 days. I packed my usual green canvas tent, a sleeping bag rated for colder nights, and a thick waterproof tarp. I also carried a simple emergency beacon, though I didn't expect to need it. I wasn't planning anything extreme, just walking, reading, maybe fishing if I felt like it. The morning I left, it was cold enough that I could see my breath as I packed the car. It was that strange in-between season where the trees had started turning orange and red, but the afternoons still got warm. I drove for about 6 hours, the highway slowly giving way to narrow, winding roads, the trees growing thicker on either side. By the time I reached the small gravel parking lot at the trailhead, it was almost noon. I slung my heavy backpack onto my shoulders, locked my car, and started walking. The trail was mostly dirt, packed hard from use, but after about 4 miles, it narrowed and became rougher. I passed a few other hikers early on, a family with 2 little kids, an older man walking a dog, but after the 5th mile, I didn't see anyone. The woods grew dense around me. The only sounds were my boots crunching fallen leaves and the occasional distant call of a crow. It took longer than I thought it would to reach the lake. The ground was uneven, and the forest floor was thick with tangled roots and mossy rocks. I had to stop a few times to catch my breath. When I finally stumbled out into a small clearing and saw the water, the sun was already low in the sky. Lake Moraine was smaller than I imagined, maybe the size of a few football fields. It was ringed by pine trees that leaned inward like they were trying to whisper secrets to each other. The surface was calm and dark, reflecting the deep blue of the sky. There was no beach, just a narrow strip of muddy shoreline with tufts of dead grass and scattered stones. It looked lonely. I loved it immediately. I found a dry, flat spot about 20 feet from the water, under a cluster of tall pines. I set up my tent, staked it down tight, and spread the tarp over it just in case it rained. I unrolled my sleeping bag inside and set up a small campfire ring with stones. I didn't light it yet. There was still enough light to make dinner without it. That first night was peaceful. I boiled water for some instant noodles, watched the sunset through the trees, and listened to the sounds of the forest coming alive. The distant hooting of owls, the gentle rustle of leaves. When it got cold enough that my breath turned to mist again, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The second day started just as perfect. I woke up early, stretched out the stiffness in my legs, and made coffee over the camp stove. I spent the morning wandering around the lake, taking photos, picking up interesting rocks, and just breathing in the crisp, pine-scented air. I didn't see another soul. It felt like the whole world had disappeared, leaving me alone with the trees and the water. But things started to feel off that afternoon. It was little things at first. While I was gathering some dead wood for the fire, I found a footprint. It was faint, like it had been made a few days ago, but it was there, pressed into the muddy bank near the lake. It wasn't mine. I could tell because it was much larger, and I had been wearing boots while this was clearly a sneaker print. I shrugged it off. Maybe someone had camped here recently. It was public land, after all. I told myself not to overthink it. Later, while I was setting up the fire, I had this weird feeling that someone was watching me. I kept glancing up, scanning the trees, but I didn't see anything. Just the same dense wall of trunks and shadows. Every time I turned away, though, the feeling crept back. It was like an itch between my shoulder blades. I blamed it on being alone too long, my mind playing tricks. That night, I was more jumpy. Every crack of a twig or flutter of leaves made my heart race. I forced myself to stay calm, sipping tea by the fire and staring into the flames until my eyes grew heavy. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. First, I didn't know why. I just lay there, frozen in my sleeping bag, listening. The forest was strangely silent. No wind, no insects, not even the usual distant calls of owls. It was like the world was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a soft, wet sound, like something moving through the mud near the water. Slow, careful steps. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The steps moved closer to my tent, then stopped. I stayed absolutely still, every muscle in my body tensed. My heart thudded so loudly in my ears that I worried whoever was out there would hear it. After what felt like an eternity, the steps moved again, this time retreating, heading back toward the lake. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I lay there, clutching my knife inside the sleeping bag, listening to every snap and creak of the forest until the first pale light of dawn seeped through the tent walls. When morning finally came, I forced myself to get up. I moved slowly, every sense on high alert. The air smelled damp and earthy, the way it does after a cold night. I checked around my camp but didn't see anything unusual. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to prove someone had been there, but I knew what I had heard. I thought about packing up and heading back to the car, but the stubborn part of me didn't want to be chased off by some random creep. Maybe it had been an animal. Maybe my mind had twisted normal forest sounds into something scarier. I decided to stay one more night, but to be extra careful. I spent the day close to camp, keeping my knife on me at all times. I even gathered a thick branch to use as a club if needed. I set up a few simple alarms, strings tied to small branches stacked with tin cans and rocks, around the perimeter of my camp. Nothing fancy, but enough to make noise if someone tried to sneak up. That evening, as the sun set, I built a bigger fire than usual. I sat closer to it, staring into the flames, ears tuned to every sound beyond the crackling wood. The forest still felt too quiet. Hours passed. The fire burned low. I was just starting to think maybe I had overreacted when I heard it again. Movement from the direction of the lake. Slow, careful steps squishing through the mud. My heart leapt into my throat. I grabbed the branch and waited, body tense. Then the cans rattled loudly, somewhere off to my right. I jumped up, holding the branch out like a baseball bat, squinting into the darkness. The fire threw flickering shadows across the trees, making everything dance and shift. I saw nothing. The forest was silent again. Minutes dragged by. I didn't dare move from the fire. I stood there for what felt like an hour, heart hammering, muscles locked. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the branch and waited, body tense. Then the cans rattled loudly, somewhere off to my right. I jumped up, holding the branch out like a baseball bat, squinting into the darkness. The fire threw flickering shadows across the trees, making everything dance and shift. I saw nothing. The forest was silent again. Minutes dragged by. I didn't dare move from the fire. I stood there for what felt like an hour, heart hammering, muscles locked. I backed slowly toward my tent, keeping my eyes on the trees, and crawled inside. I didn't sleep. I just sat there, clutching my knife, waiting for anything, to happen. Nothing did. When the sky finally began to lighten, I packed up camp as fast as I could. I stuffed the sleeping bag into my pack, ripped the stakes out of the ground, and rolled up the tent without even folding it neatly. I just wanted to be gone. I didn't even eat breakfast. I threw on my backpack, grabbed the branch, and started hiking back toward the trailhead. The walk back was brutal. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like someone following me. My feet slipped on wet leaves, and I almost twisted my ankle twice. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see a dark figure slipping between the trees. But I didn't see anyone. It took hours, but I finally reached the parking lot. My car was still there, dusty but untouched. I threw my pack into the back seat, climbed in, and locked the doors before I even started the engine. As I drove away, bouncing down the gravel road, I felt the knot in my chest loosen a little. The farther I got from that lake, the easier it was to breathe. By the time I reached the highway, it almost felt like a bad dream. I never went back to Lake Moraine. I never found out who or what had been creeping around my camp at night. Maybe it was a hunter, lost or drunk. Maybe it was some unhinged loner living out in the woods. It was the summer of 2017 when I decided to go camping alone. I had been to plenty of campsites with friends, but this time I wanted to go by myself. Just me, the woods, and a few days of solitude. The campsite I chose was somewhere deep in the Appalachian Mountains, near a quiet lake, not far from a small town called McDowell. It was the perfect spot. Isolated, peaceful, and a far enough drive from the noise of the city to clear my mind. I was 29 years old, at a point in my life where I needed to recharge, escape from the stress of work, and find some time to think. I arrived at the site just before sunset. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. I unloaded my gear, tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, and a few books I hoped to read by the campfire. I set up my tent quickly, making sure it was secure and facing the lake. The sky above was a deepening shade of purple, and the air had a cool bite to it. There was something calming about being in nature alone, without the distractions of everyday life. I knew I would be far from any phone service, and that was exactly what I needed. As darkness fell, I made a small fire and started to prepare a simple dinner. Canned beans and some sausages I had brought along. The crackling of the fire was comforting, and the stars above were brighter than I'd ever seen before. It felt like the world was a million miles away, and for a moment, I was at peace. The first night passed without incident. I slept soundly in the tent, tucked away from the cool night air. The next morning, I woke up early to the sound of birds singing and the faint rustling of animals in the woods. I stretched, got dressed, and took a short walk down to the lake, which was still and glassy, reflecting the trees and the sky above. It was the kind of scene you see in postcards, perfectly still, serene, and untouched by human hands. After my walk, I decided to go on a hike to explore the surrounding area. The trail was narrow, overgrown in parts, and wound through dense woods. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the silence and the solitude. The deeper I went into the forest, the more isolated I felt. There were no signs of other campers, no distant sounds of traffic or the hum of technology. It was just me and the wilderness. By midday, I had walked several miles from camp and found a small clearing with a view of the mountains in the distance. I sat down to rest and pulled out a water bottle, drinking in the fresh air. That's when I noticed something strange. A faint trail of disturbed earth leading into the trees. It wasn't like a typical animal trail. It was more deliberate, as if someone had been walking through the woods recently. My first thought was that maybe it was another hiker, but the more I looked at it, the more it didn't seem right. The soil had been scraped away in long, straight lines, almost like someone had dragged something heavy across the ground. Curious, I decided to follow the trail, staying as quiet as I could. The trail led me through thicker woods, and I had to step carefully over branches and rocks. It didn't take long for me to notice something even more unsettling. The trees around me seemed to close in, blocking out much of the sunlight. The air grew cooler, and there was an eerie stillness to the forest. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves underfoot. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I reached a small ridge and paused to look around. In the distance, I could see the lake where I had been earlier, and I could also see the vague outline of my campsite. But what caught my eye was something else. Just beyond a thick group of trees, I saw the shape of a small shack. It was tucked away in a part of the forest that seemed much more remote than the rest. I hadn't seen any signs of buildings or structures on the map before I came here, and it seemed odd that I hadn't noticed it from a distance earlier. My curiosity got the best of me, and I made my way toward the shack. The closer I got, the more I realized it wasn't a well-maintained structure. It looked old, really old, and there was a sense of neglect around it. The roof had holes, and the walls were weathered and sagging. There were no windows, only gaps in the walls where the wood had rotted away. I approached the shack cautiously, trying to get a better look. As I circled around it, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. It was just wide enough to slip through, and I found myself compelled to go inside. There was nothing particularly remarkable inside, just dust, cobwebs, and a few broken pieces of old furniture. But there was something about the place that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It felt as if the shack had been forgotten for years, yet there was a strange sense of life around it, like someone or something had been here recently. I decided to leave, feeling uneasy and not wanting to linger any longer. As I turned to leave, I heard a noise from outside, something faint but unmistakable. A twig snapped, followed by a rustling sound. I froze, my heart rate quickening. I hadn't seen anyone in the woods since I started my hike, and now it seemed like someone, or something, was watching me. I didn't wait around to find out. I bolted from the shack, sprinting back toward the trail. I could hear the rustling behind me, growing louder as I pushed myself harder. The air felt thicker, the trees seemed to close in on me, and every time I looked over my shoulder, I saw nothing but the shadows of the woods. By the time I reached the trail again, I was panting heavily, my legs aching from the sprint. I didn't stop. I kept going, pushing through the pain, the fear, and the rising panic. I didn't know what was behind me, but I knew I didn't want to find out. It felt like I was being chased, even though I never saw anyone. Finally, I reached the campsite, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't stop to set up the fire. I just grabbed my things, shoved them into my backpack, and started packing up my tent. My hands were shaking as I worked, but I didn't care. I had to leave, and I had to leave now. Whatever it was in the woods, I didn't want to be anywhere near it. By the time I finished packing, it was almost dark again. I didn't waste any time. I made my way back to the car, not looking back at the campsite. The road back to town felt like it took forever, but eventually, I pulled into the small town of McDowell. I found a motel, checked in without a word, and locked the door behind me. I was exhausted, but the events of the day kept my mind racing. What had I encountered out there? Who or what had been in the woods with me? I never went back to that campsite. I don't know who owns that shack or what purpose it served, but I don't need to know. The fear I felt out there was real, and I've learned to trust my instincts. That place was meant to be forgotten, and I plan on keeping it that way. The mountains are beautiful, but some parts of the wilderness are better left unexplored. I still go camping from time to time, but I stick to more popular campsites now, places where I feel safe and can enjoy the solitude without the weight of fear. That experience taught me that not all wilderness is meant to be conquered, and sometimes it's better to leave some places alone. I will never forget the feeling of being watched, of hearing those footsteps behind me in the woods. It was real, and it was something I'll carry with me forever. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel road broke the silence as I drove deeper into the woods. The narrow trail twisted through dense trees that seemed to close in on me as I made my way toward the cabin. I had been looking forward to this weekend getaway for months. My name is Mike, and I'm 32 years old, working a job that left me constantly stressed out. I had told my friends I was going to take a break, get away from everything, and just relax. I had never been to this cabin before, but it was supposed to be the perfect place for solitude. The sky was overcast as I pulled up to the cabin. It stood alone, surrounded by tall pine trees, with no other buildings in sight. The air was crisp, and the smell of wet pine filled my nose as I stepped out of the car. There was something quiet about it, a stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I shrugged it off. It was just the wilderness. I had spent a lot of time in the woods before. This would be no different. I grabbed my duffel bag from the back seat and walked up to the cabin, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The front door was unlocked, which struck me as odd, but I didn't give it much thought. I had rented the place after all. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and campfire. It wasn't unpleasant, but it felt a little musty. There was a large stone fireplace against one wall, a few mismatched chairs scattered around, and an old wooden table in the center of the room. The furniture looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I took a deep breath and set my bag down on one of the chairs. The windows were all covered with thick curtains, making the place feel dark despite the afternoon light outside. I drew the curtains back from one of the windows and looked out at the dense forest. It stretched for miles, and I could barely see the sky through the thick canopy of trees. The cabin was simple, but it had everything I needed. A small kitchen with an old stove and refrigerator, a bathroom that looked like it had been renovated recently, and a small bedroom with a bed covered in a patchwork quilt. I unpacked my things, hanging up a few clothes, setting up a small stack of books on the table, and putting my laptop on the nightstand. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned food I had brought with me and spent the evening reading by the fire. The only sound was the occasional crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside. It was peaceful, which was exactly what I needed. I eventually went to bed and fell into a deep sleep, undisturbed by any noise or interruptions. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of fresh coffee. The cabin was still quiet, the only sound being the occasional creak of the wooden beams above. I went into the kitchen and made myself some breakfast, thinking about going for a hike later in the day. The weather was still overcast, but the clouds had parted slightly, allowing a little bit of sunlight to peek through. After breakfast, I grabbed my jacket and headed outside. The air was chilly, but it felt good to stretch my legs after the long drive. I walked a little ways down the gravel road, then veered off onto a small trail that led deeper into the woods. I had no particular destination in mind, just wanted to take in the beauty of the surroundings. As I walked, I noticed how quiet it was. Too quiet. The only sounds were my footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. No animals, no insects buzzing around, just an unnatural silence. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was off and continued on, but it was hard to ignore the way the woods seemed to close in around me. About an hour later, I turned back and headed toward the cabin. As I walked back, I felt the strange sensation that I was being watched. I couldn't shake it, no matter how much I told myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on me. When I returned to the cabin, I immediately locked the door behind me. I didn't know why, but I felt better with it locked, even though I knew no one was around for miles. I spent the rest of the afternoon inside, trying to distract myself with my laptop and a book, but the uneasy feeling persisted. Every time I looked out the window, the trees seemed to be moving in a way that didn't seem natural. It was as if something was lurking just beyond the edge of the woods, watching me. It didn't make any sense, of course, but the feeling was there. As the evening approached, I decided to light a fire and relax by it. The flames crackled, and the warmth of the fire felt comforting. But no matter how much I tried to relax, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't the cabin per se, but the feeling of isolation. There was no one for miles. No neighbors, no phone service, no internet. I was alone, completely alone. That night, I slept fitfully. I kept waking up, feeling like I was being watched. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to move, and the creaking of the wooden beams kept me on edge. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed up my things quickly, not wanting to stay another night in that place. As I was gathering my belongings, I heard a noise outside. It sounded like something was moving around the side of the cabin. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't bring myself to look out the window, but I knew something was there. Something was out there. I grabbed my keys and hurried out the door, locking it behind me. I didn't care about anything anymore. I just needed to get out of there. The drive back to the main road felt like it took forever. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing. The woods remained silent, as they had been the entire time I had been there. By the time I reached the highway, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I was out. I was safe. But something still lingered in the back of my mind, a nagging feeling that I couldn't quite place. I couldn't explain it, but I couldn't shake it either. It wasn't until I was home and unpacking my things that I found it. A small, crudely carved wooden figure hidden in the bottom of my duffel bag. It was shaped like a person, though it was far from lifelike. The figure was rough, the edges jagged, and there was something deeply unsettling about the way it had been made. It didn't belong in my bag. I hadn't packed it. I stared at the figure for a long time, trying to make sense of it. But I couldn't. I didn't want to think about it anymore. I didn't want to remember that cabin, the woods, the feeling that I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain it, but it didn't matter. I wasn't going back. That cabin, those woods, whatever they were better left behind. I threw the figure away, never to think about it again. But the nagging feeling, the sense of being watched, never really left. The first night alone in the cabin should have felt peaceful. That's what I kept telling myself when I stepped off the gravel road, pulled the door shut behind me, and felt the lock click into place. The kind of peace you never get in a city, the kind that comes from the silence of the forest, the way the trees seem to stand so still, almost as if they're watching. I'd rented the cabin for a week, with no intention of leaving early. No phone service, no interruptions, just me, a small fire, and the kind of stillness I thought I was craving. I'd spent months thinking about this trip. The idea of getting away, far from the noise of work, the pressure of social media, and the constant buzz of city life. The cabin was in a secluded area, tucked away in the thick woods of northern Minnesota. The cabin's owner, an older man named Hank, told me over the phone that the nearest town was a good hour's drive away. So if I needed anything, I'd have to drive myself. I was fine with that. I wanted isolation. I wanted quiet. The cabin itself was charming, if not a little run down. The wood creaked beneath my boots as I stepped across the old floorboards, the smell of pine and damp earth seeping through the walls. The living room had a small stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. But I had no problem with that. The old leather armchair in front of it looked worn, but comfortable, and I couldn't help but sink into it, feeling the weight of the world lift off my shoulders. I'd brought enough food and supplies to last me for the week: canned goods, pasta, some fresh vegetables, a couple of steaks. Everything I needed to cook on the small stove or over the open fire outside. I'd also packed some books and my journal. The plan was simple: wake up, read, cook, hike, sleep, repeat. It seemed like the perfect way to recharge. The first day passed quickly. I spent the morning exploring the woods around the cabin. The forest was dense, with thick underbrush and towering pines. It was easy to lose track of time, and by the time I returned to the cabin, the sun was dipping low behind the trees. I built a fire outside, set up my camp chair, and sat down with a beer to watch the light fade into twilight. As the night deepened, the only sounds I could hear were the crackling of the fire, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the soft hoots of owls somewhere in the distance. But then, as I sat there, a strange sound caught my attention. It was faint at first, almost like a low whisper on the wind. It sounded like someone was walking on the gravel path that led to the cabin. I froze, straining my ears to listen. The sound didn't come from the road behind the cabin. It came from the woods, from the direction I just walked earlier. My heart skipped a beat, but I brushed it off. Could have been an animal or maybe a branch falling, something like that. Still, I felt uneasy. I glanced toward the trees, but the shadows were too thick to see anything clearly. After a moment, I stood up, grabbing the flashlight from the table. I scanned the area around the cabin, but there was nothing, just the dark woods, the flickering firelight, and the soft whispering of the wind. The sound stopped, and with it, my unease faded. I figured it was just my nerves, maybe the unfamiliar surroundings playing tricks on me. I hadn't been alone in a while after all. I went inside, locked the door, and settled in for the night. The fire inside crackled as I flipped through the pages of one of my books, the warmth of the flames easing the tension from my shoulders. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the sound again, the footsteps in the woods, too close to be just the wind. My mind kept wandering if someone had been out there, watching the cabin. The second day was better. I took a long hike to the nearby lake, enjoying the peace of being alone. But the moment I returned, the unease returned with it. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching the cabin. My mind kept drifting back to the sound I'd heard the night before, but when I checked the area around the cabin, I saw no signs of anyone. That evening, I decided to go to bed early. I was tired from the hike and the unsettling thoughts, so I crawled under the thick blanket and tried to settle into the bed. As the night deepened, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, but I wasn't as disturbed by it anymore. The woods were alive at night, I reminded myself. The animals, the wind, it was all part of the experience. At least, that's what I told myself until I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were louder, closer. I bolted upright in bed, heart racing. The footsteps were unmistakable now. Someone was definitely walking outside the cabin, and they were getting closer. The gravel crunched beneath the weight of each step. My pulse quickened as I heard the soft rustling of leaves near the cabin's back door. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the window, pressing my face against the cool glass, straining to see anything in the dark. My hands were shaking, and my breath was shallow. The flashlight flickered as I turned it on, but all I could see was the swirling darkness of the forest. No figures, no movement. Then the sound stopped. Just like that, I spent the next hour sitting in the chair, the flashlight still clenched in my hand, staring into the blackness outside. I couldn't tell if I was waiting for something to happen or if I was too scared to sleep. But eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell asleep in the chair, the beam of the flashlight cutting through the room like a lonely sentinel. The next day was a blur. I didn't leave the cabin, didn't feel safe enough to step outside. I checked the area around the cabin again, but found nothing unusual. No footprints, no signs of anyone being there. I started to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks, that I was alone in the woods after all. Yet, the feeling of being watched never left me. The days dragged on like that. Every night, the footsteps returned. Sometimes they were louder, sometimes they were quieter, but they were always there. Always coming from the direction of the trees, always getting closer. I stopped going outside after dark. The idea of walking the path back to the cabin in the pitch-black dark filled me with dread. It felt like someone was waiting, just out of sight, waiting for me to make a mistake. On the fourth day, the weather changed. A storm rolled in, heavy rain and strong winds that lashed against the windows of the cabin. It felt like the world outside had been swallowed whole by the storm, and I was trapped in the cabin with only the crackling fire and the sound of the rain to keep me company. As night fell, the storm only intensified, the wind howling through the trees like some wild animal. I stayed in the cabin, huddled near the fire, staring out the window at the sheets of rain. The footsteps had stopped completely, but something about the silence felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching. I don't know what made me finally check the back door, but I did. I slowly approached the door, my fingers brushing against the handle, my breath caught in my throat. I had to know. I had to see if I was imagining it all. When I opened the door, I was met with the cold rush of rain. The wind whipped the water into my face, but as I stepped outside, my eyes went straight to the ground. There, in the mud near the back of the cabin, were fresh footprints, Large, heavy prints, the kind that didn't belong to any animal I recognized. They led off into the trees, disappearing into the dark woods. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest as I stared at the tracks. There was no doubt now. Someone had been out there watching me, but I wasn't alone anymore. I knew exactly what I had to do. I locked the door behind me, grabbed my gear, and ran for the car. It took everything I had to stay calm, to focus on getting out of there without making a sound, without looking back. I left the cabin behind in the rain and mud, speeding down the road away from the woods, away from the thing that had been watching me. By the time I reached the nearest town, I felt like I was finally safe. I spent the night in a cheap motel, still shaking from the adrenaline and fear. The next morning, I called Hank to tell him what had happened. He was quiet for a long time on the phone, and then, finally, he said, "I should have warned you. That place. It's been abandoned for years, but there's always someone nearby, always someone keeping an eye on it." It wasn't the storm, or the trees, or the footsteps that I would remember the most about that trip. It was the feeling of being watched, the sense that I was never truly alone, even when I thought I was. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was never meant to stay there. It was late autumn when I decided to head up to the cabin. I'd been going through a rough patch in life, after some difficult personal setbacks, losing my job, a failed relationship, and a string of bad luck. I felt like I needed to get away from everything. Somewhere quiet, isolated, with no distractions. The cabin I rented was nestled deep in the woods, far from the nearest town, and it seemed like the perfect escape. The cabin itself was modest, a simple wooden structure with a slanted roof, set in a small clearing surrounded by towering pine trees. It wasn't luxurious by any means, but I didn't care. It had a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen with an old fridge, and a single room with a bed in the corner. Outside, there was a small porch that overlooked the dense forest. I'd rented it for a week, hoping that the solitude would help me clear my head. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the horizon. The air was crisp and smelled of earth and pine, a welcome change from the polluted city air. I unloaded my car, unpacking my things, a few clothes, some books, and a couple of cans of soup. The cabin was exactly what I expected, old, but functional. There was a strange stillness to the place, but I chalked it up to the isolation. The nearest neighbors were miles away. That first evening, I lit a fire in the stove and made myself a quick meal. The crackling of the fire was the only sound in the cabin, and it made me feel at ease. It was peaceful. After dinner, I sat by the fire, reading a book I'd brought along. I was exhausted from the drive and the emotional toll of the past few months, so I decided to turn in early. The bed was small but comfortable, and I quickly fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun had just risen, casting a soft orange glow through the trees outside. The air inside the cabin was cold, but the stove still had some embers from last night's fire. I threw a few more logs on the stove and made myself a cup of coffee. The stillness of the morning was beautiful. I had the entire day ahead of me to do whatever I wanted. Hike, read, maybe even explore the surrounding woods. I spent the first part of the morning walking through the forest. There were no trails, no markers, just trees and underbrush. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the air was still, broken only by the occasional rustle of a squirrel or the call of a bird. It was the kind of quiet I'd been longing for. There was something calming about being completely alone in the woods. As I wandered deeper into the forest, I began to notice that the trees felt different. The farther I walked, the thicker the forest became, and the sunlight had a harder time breaking through the dense canopy above. The woods had an odd, oppressive quality to them. It was hard to put my finger on it, but I felt like I was being watched, like there was something just out of sight. I tried to shake off the feeling. After all, I was alone in the woods, and it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. It stayed with me, growing stronger the deeper I went. Eventually, I decided to turn back. I had wandered far enough to know I didn't want to get lost, and my thoughts were becoming increasingly paranoid. I retraced my steps and made my way back toward the cabin. The feeling of being watched didn't fade, and I started to feel uncomfortable. When I returned to the cabin, I was relieved to be out of the woods. I made myself another cup of coffee and sat by the stove. My mind was racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, even though there was no logical reason to think so. I tried to relax, telling myself I was just overthinking things. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the sense of unease. The silence in the cabin was deafening, and every creak of the wooden floorboards, every gust of wind outside, made me tense up. The next few days followed a similar pattern. I spent my mornings hiking in the woods, exploring a little farther each day, but I always felt like something was off. The woods were always quiet, too quiet, and no matter how much I tried to push the feeling aside, I couldn't escape it. At night, I kept the fire going in the stove, the crackling of the wood being the only sound to break the silence. On the fourth day, things started to get strange. I woke up to find that the door to the cabin had been opened during the night. I was sure I'd locked it before going to bed, but there it was, slightly ajar. I stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door. My heart started racing. Maybe I'd forgotten to lock it, but no, I was certain I had. I stepped cautiously toward the door and peered outside. The air was still, the forest unchanged. Nothing looked out of place. I closed the door and locked it again, trying to calm myself. But the unease lingered, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been inside. I tried to brush it off, but that evening, I noticed something else. There were tracks in the dirt near the cabin. Fresh footprints, leading toward the cabin from the woods. They were large, too large to be an animal's, and they weren't mine. I froze when I saw them, the blood draining from my face. Who else could be out here? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and I hadn't seen anyone since I arrived. I immediately went inside and locked the door again, but this time, I didn't feel safe. My thoughts were racing. I had to leave. I should have packed up and driven away that very moment. But a strange sense of dread kept me rooted in place. I couldn't explain it, but the idea of leaving didn't feel right. Instead, I decided to wait. I stayed up late that night, keeping a vigilant watch, my eyes constantly scanning the darkness outside the cabin's windows. The night was unbearably quiet. I barely slept, and every small sound made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard something, a faint tapping at the door. It was so quiet that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I waited, holding my breath, but there it was again, a soft, rhythmic tapping. My heart pounded in my chest as I got out of bed, creeping toward the door. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, listening for any further sounds. But there was nothing, no more tapping. The silence seemed to stretch on, thick and oppressive. Eventually, I mustered the courage to open the door a crack. I peered outside, but there was nothing there. No person, no animal. The forest stood still under the dim light of the moon, and the air was thick with the scent of pine. It was so quiet, it felt unnatural. I closed the door quickly and locked it again. My hands were shaking. I didn't know what to think anymore. I didn't know if someone was out there, or if I was simply losing my mind. The next day, I decided to leave. I packed up my things, my heart still racing with the adrenaline of fear. As I was about to head out, I noticed something strange. There were more footprints near the cabin, but these ones were closer. They led right up to the porch. I didn't know what to think, but I didn't want to find out. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. As I drove down the winding road, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. The farther I got from the cabin, the lighter I felt. By the time I reached the nearest town, the unease had started to fade, but I still couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong. I never went back to that cabin, and even now, as I sit here writing this, I can still remember the feeling of being watched, the eerie silence, and the unmistakable sense that something was lurking just beyond the trees. In the end, I got what I needed from that trip: isolation, peace, and the space to think. But I also learned something else, that some places are better left unexplored. Some silence is too heavy, and some woods are too quiet. The cabin may have given me the escape I wanted, but in the end, it was the very place that made me realize that sometimes the most frightening thing is not what you see, but what you can't. The trees were dense here. I could see how easily anyone could get lost in the forest. I was 26, and this cabin, this tiny old cabin in the middle of nowhere, was my escape for the weekend. I'd been working long hours at a desk job, and the idea of getting away from it all for a couple of days seemed like the only way I could unwind. The cabin wasn't much, but that's part of its charm. It was the kind of place you could forget about the hustle and bustle of life, get some fresh air, and just breathe. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal, no distractions. Just me, the wilderness, and a few days of silence. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, just before the sun started to dip behind the trees. The air was already cooling, and the faint smell of pine filled my nose. I parked the car in the small clearing just beyond the cabin's porch, grabbed my backpack, and made my way inside. The place was even more rustic than I expected. The floors creaked under my feet as I stepped inside. It had that old, musty smell, mixed with wood and the faint trace of mildew. There were wooden beams overhead, a simple stone fireplace in the corner, and a set of windows that looked out over a small, overgrown yard and the forest beyond. It felt remote, cut off from the rest of the world. I wasn't sure why, but I felt a little uneasy. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe just the thought of being alone in a place this far out in the woods. I shoved it aside. This was what I wanted. Quiet, solitude. The only company was the trees and the sound of the wind. I unpacked my things, hung my jacket on a hook by the door, and decided to make a fire. It took a while, but eventually, the crackling flames filled the space with warmth. I sat in front of the fire, trying to relax. My body was still tense from the week's stress, but as the night deepened, I felt myself slowly starting to unwind. I set up a few candles around the room for light. The flickering flame was soothing, and the cabin felt more like a retreat. The first night was peaceful, the kind of stillness that feels deep in your bones. I made myself some instant noodles, and after dinner, I sat by the fire for a while longer, watching the flames dance. Eventually, the sound of the wind outside started to lull me to sleep. I grabbed an old blanket from the couch and laid down on the floor, near the fire but just far enough away so that the heat wouldn't get too intense. That's when I heard it. First, it was faint, just a crack, a sharp snap, almost like a branch breaking under weight. I stopped breathing for a moment, listening. The wind was picking up outside, and I wondered if it had just been that, the trees swaying and creaking under the pressure of the gusts. But then it came again, a footstep, slow, deliberate. I sat up, my heart thudding in my chest. I strained my ears, listening carefully. The cabin was silent again, but the sound had been unmistakable. Someone or something was outside. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a deer or some other animal, wandering close to the cabin. But the more I thought about it, the less it seemed like that was the case. The footsteps didn't sound like an animal. They sounded too heavy, too measured. I pushed myself to my feet, feeling the cold wood beneath my bare feet as I crept toward the window. I was trying not to make a sound, but the floorboards creaked under my weight. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't see anything through the dark, thick trees outside. The wind howled through the branches, but there was no sign of anything. No figure, no movement. I waited. A few minutes passed, and still nothing. The only sound was the wind, and the occasional snap of a branch breaking in the forest. I shook my head, trying to calm myself. This wasn't a horror story, I reminded myself. I wasn't out in the middle of nowhere to find ghosts. But still, the uneasy feeling lingered, gnawing at my nerves. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every snap of a branch made my heart race. I kept hearing those footsteps in my mind. I told myself I was just imagining it, that I was overstressed and had let my mind run wild. The next day, I woke up with bags under my eyes, but the morning light brought a sense of calm. The forest was peaceful in the daylight, and the sun cast a warm glow on the cabin. I made a cup of coffee and sat by the window, staring out at the trees. I could hear the birds chirping, the occasional rustle of leaves, and the distant sound of something, maybe a squirrel or a bird, moving through the brush. It was beautiful in a way to be surrounded by all that quiet. But then, as I took another sip of my coffee, I noticed something odd. The bushes near the edge of the clearing seemed to move, just slightly, as though something had brushed past them. I froze, staring at the spot. My heart skipped a beat. Could it be a person? But no, no one would be out here. It had to be an animal. Yet a part of me wasn't so sure. I spent the rest of the morning unpacking and organizing. I tried to push the unease out of my mind, but it wasn't working. The sound of footsteps echoed in my thoughts. The images of shadows moving outside the window, of something lurking just beyond my view, kept creeping in. Still, I told myself I was being paranoid. The wind played tricks with your mind. The forest had its own rhythm, and when you were this far out, anything could sound like something else. By mid-afternoon, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. I grabbed my jacket and headed out the door, into the crisp, cool air. The trees were thick, but the trail I followed was wide enough to see the ground clearly. The dirt path twisted and wound through the woods, with patches of sunlight filtering through the canopy overhead. It was peaceful, just me, the sound of my boots crunching on the earth, and the faint calls of distant birds. After about an hour of walking, I stopped to rest on a large fallen log. My legs were sore from the climb, and the quiet of the forest made it easy to lose track of time. I thought about going further, but something in the back of my mind told me I'd gone far enough. I didn't want to get lost. I turned around to head back, but something made me stop. A figure, no more than a shadow, moved at the edge of the trees. My stomach dropped. I froze, watching, my mind racing. I didn't want to make a sound, but my breath came faster. The shadow didn't move again. It was still, just standing there, like it was waiting for something. I stood there for what felt like forever, not sure what to do. But finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the figure turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't follow it. I didn't even move for a moment, just stood there, staring into the spot where the figure had been. Then, without thinking, I walked back toward the cabin as quickly as I could. My heart was pounding in my chest, my footsteps loud on the trail. I didn't stop until I was back in the cabin, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I didn't hear footsteps again, but the weight of the silence was heavier now. Every noise, every creak, felt too loud. I stayed up most of the night, staring at the fire, listening to the wind. I wanted to leave, but there was nowhere to go. The thought of driving back down the long, winding road in the dark felt worse than staying. The next morning, I packed my things early. I didn't care about the hike I had planned or the peaceful solitude I'd sought. I just wanted to get out of the cabin and back to civilization. The forest felt suffocating now, like it was closing in around me. As I packed my car, I glanced back at the cabin. It looked so small and innocent, just a building among the trees. But the memories of the past 2 days stuck with me. The shadows, the footsteps, the feeling of being watched. I never found out who or what was out there in the woods. The person I thought I saw in the trees was never found. I don't think I'll ever know for sure, but I did leave that cabin behind. And for the rest of my life, I'll never forget the quiet, the eerie stillness that filled the air, and the strange feeling that the woods were never as empty as they seemed. The old cabin sat nestled in the woods, far from the nearest road. I had found it through an online listing, a cheap getaway in the mountains, far enough from the bustle of everyday life to truly disconnect. The pictures on the website showed a cozy, rustic cabin surrounded by towering pines, a wood-burning stove, and old-world charm. They didn't show the things the camera couldn't capture, the smell of mold in the walls or the creaky, shifting foundations. But I didn't mind. I was tired, burnt out, and I needed a break. I'm Ben, by the way. I'm 32, living in a small apartment in the city, working long hours at a tech startup that felt more like a hamster wheel than a career. My life was a blur of meetings, emails, and deadlines. This trip to the cabin was supposed to be my escape, a quiet week alone to decompress and recharge. I arrived on a crisp September afternoon, the sun dipping low in the sky. The drive had been long, about 6 hours, and by the time I turned off the narrow dirt road toward the cabin, my body was sore from sitting. The last few miles had been a winding, bumpy ride through the forest, where the trees closed in on both sides, almost like they were trying to swallow the road. The GPS had told me I was close, but the signal was weak out here, and I had to rely on the written directions I had printed out. The cabin itself wasn't impressive at first sight, just a simple 2-story building made of weathered wood with a shingled roof. It looked like something out of an old movie, charming but a little run down. A front porch, crooked in places, with a couple of rocking chairs on it. The wooden steps creaked under my weight as I made my way up to the door. I unlocked it with the key the owner had left for me in a lockbox by the door. The smell of musty wood and old carpet hit me immediately. It wasn't unpleasant, just old. The interior was dim, lit only by a few thin beams of light coming through the dust-covered windows. The furniture was old too. An overstuffed couch, a couple of mismatched chairs, a fireplace with logs stacked neatly by the hearth. I dumped my bag on the bed in the small upstairs bedroom and decided to make myself a drink. There was a bottle of whiskey on the counter, a gift from the cabin owner. I poured myself a glass and took a long sip, letting the warmth spread through me. The solitude of the place began to settle in, and I felt a rare sense of peace. I hadn't had a moment to myself like this in months, maybe even years. The evening passed slowly. I spent it reading a book I'd brought, sipping my whiskey, and watching the shadows grow longer outside as the sun set. By the time it got dark, the air was thick with the sounds of the forest, distant hoots of owls, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the occasional snap of a twig. It wasn't unsettling. In fact, it was kind of comforting. I decided to head to bed early, maybe get up at dawn and take a hike the next day. The room was cold, so I threw an extra blanket over the bed and turned out the lights. It didn't take long for sleep to claim me. The next morning, I woke up early, around 6, to the sharp, cold air coming through the cracks in the window. The sun hadn't fully risen, but the light was enough to illuminate the landscape outside. I could see the thick forest stretching out beyond the cabin, the trees forming a solid wall of green. I spent the day hiking the nearby trails, exploring the small streams and rocky outcrops that dotted the landscape. There was something almost therapeutic about it. The physical exertion, the smell of pine and earth, the quiet. I felt my stress and anxiety slowly ebbing away as I breathed in the clean air and let my thoughts wander. It was exactly what I needed. That evening, after a long day of hiking, I was exhausted. I sat on the porch, a hot cup of coffee in my hands, watching the sky fade to twilight. There was something serene about the place, but also something unsettling. Maybe it was just the isolation, or maybe it was the fact that I hadn't seen a single soul since I'd arrived. No other cabins nearby, no hikers on the trails, not even a passing car on the dirt road. The wind started to pick up as the night settled in, causing the trees to sway gently. It made a low, whistling sound through the branches, almost like a distant voice, but I brushed it off. Nature had a way of playing tricks on the mind. The night stretched on, and I retreated into the cabin, locking the door behind me. The fire crackled in the hearth, and I cooked a simple meal of pasta with canned tomatoes. As the warmth of the fire wrapped around me, I felt at ease, or so I thought. It was around 11 that things started to get strange. I was sitting on the couch, trying to finish a book when I heard a faint noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft thud, almost like something had fallen over upstairs. At first, I thought it was the house settling, the old wood creaking as it did every night. But then I heard it again. A series of muffled footsteps, dragging, slow and deliberate, from above me. I froze. My heart skipped a beat, but I tried to reason with myself. It was probably a raccoon or some other animal rummaging around in the attic. Maybe the roof was leaking, or there was a loose board that caused the noise. I stood up and made my way to the stairs. The cabin was dark except for the glow of the fire, casting long shadows across the room. I grabbed the flashlight I had packed in my bag and flicked it on, casting its beam down the hallway toward the staircase. The air felt cold in that hallway, colder than the rest of the house. It wasn't normal. I slowly ascended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. When I reached the top, I checked the hallway and the 2 rooms, one of which was the bedroom I'd been sleeping in. Nothing seemed out of place, but the feeling of unease was growing, something gnawing at the edges of my mind. I returned downstairs and checked all the windows and doors, ensuring everything was locked. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I had this odd sense of being watched, like I wasn't alone. The night passed uneventfully after that. I tried to sleep but was restless. My mind kept drifting back to those noises. I eventually managed to fall into a fitful sleep. The next morning, the feeling of unease hadn't left. I went about my day as usual. Another hike, more reading, but there was a strange tension hanging in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It was about 4 in the afternoon when I heard it again. The dragging sound, this time louder, closer. It was coming from the attic. My blood ran cold. I stood motionless, listening. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath me. Then, the sound returned. Slow, dragging footsteps, deliberate and heavy. This wasn't an animal. This was something else, something human. I rushed upstairs again, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed a broom from the closet and stood at the foot of the attic door. It was locked from the inside. I turned the knob, but it wouldn't budge. I couldn't explain it, but I knew. Something was in there. I wasn't sure what to do, but I couldn't leave. I went back down and grabbed my phone, but the signal was still spotty out here, making it impossible to reach anyone. My only option was to leave the cabin. I packed my things quickly, grabbed my bag, and headed out the door, leaving the cabin behind me. I never looked back, but as I walked down the trail, I thought I saw a figure standing at the window, watching me. It wasn't until I got to the car, speeding away from the cabin, that I realized there had never been anyone else around. No neighbors, no people, just the woods and the eerie quiet. That was my last visit to that cabin. The next day, I found out that the owner had suddenly disappeared. No one knew where he went or why. The cabin sat vacant, untouched, a reminder of the strange, unsettling week I had spent there. I don't know who or what was in that attic, but I do know that I won't be going back. The forest, the cabin, and whatever else was in those walls, it can all stay there. Some things are bet. I didn't expect the cabin to feel so off. When I first looked at it online, I thought it would be the perfect escape. Just a weekend retreat in the woods to get away from the chaos of my day-to-day life. I'm 32, and this was my first solo trip in years. I needed the silence, the quiet, a break from everything. The cabin was listed on a rural getaway website, tucked away in the woods near a small town called Riverbend, which was a good 2-hour drive away from where I lived. It was an old place, with rough-hewn wooden walls, a stone chimney, and a wide porch that faced a dense forest. There were no neighbors for miles, which was exactly what I wanted. When I arrived that Friday afternoon, the weather was perfect. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow on the trees. I parked the car in the gravel driveway, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the front door. The steps creaked under my boots, and I could smell the musty scent of old wood as I unlocked the door. Inside, the place was smaller than I expected, but cozy. A fireplace sat at the far end of the living room, a leather couch, and a small wooden coffee table in front of it. The kitchen was basic but functional. The windows were covered in thick, dark curtains that blocked the outside world from view. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just happy to be away from the noise. I set my bags down, went into the bathroom, and then checked out the second bedroom. It had a small, worn-out bed, the kind of place that felt like it had been slept in 100 times before. There was a wardrobe in the corner, but it was empty, except for a thin layer of dust. I spent the next few hours unpacking, enjoying the peace. I made myself some dinner, a quick pasta with whatever I had brought. The cabin didn't feel so much alive as it felt stagnant. The air was heavy, and I thought it was just because it had been closed up for a while. I cracked a window in the living room to let in some fresh air. Night fell fast, and soon I was sitting on the couch, watching the flames in the fireplace crackle. The silence was the loudest thing about the place. It wasn't peaceful. It was unsettling. There was no sound of wildlife, no breeze rustling the leaves outside. The silence pressed down on me, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. I thought I heard a sound from the back of the cabin, a creak, followed by what sounded like a faint thud. It was probably just the house settling, I told myself. But then I heard it again, this time louder, closer. A scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. My heart raced for a second, but I shook it off. I had rented this cabin to get away from everything. I wasn't gonna let my mind play tricks on me. I stood up, walked to the back door, and peered out. Nothing but the thick blackness of the forest. The trees stood still in the night air, and the wind had picked up, rustling the branches. I turned around, half expecting to find something. Someone behind me, but there was nothing. The place was empty, just me and the old wooden walls. I felt ridiculous standing there. It was probably just a critter, I thought. There was nothing out there that could hurt me. I was safe. I locked the back door and double-checked the windows. Then, I grabbed a book off the shelf and tried to settle back down, but the odd feeling wouldn't leave. It was as if the cabin itself was watching me. That night, I woke up in the middle of a strange dream. The sound of something scratching against the walls filled my ears. I bolted upright in bed, disoriented, heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light coming from the moon through the window. I lay there listening. The noise had stopped, but then I heard it again. This time it was coming from the direction of the bedroom door. Slowly, so slowly, I got up and grabbed the flashlight I had packed, my hands shaking. I didn't know what I expected to find. An animal, maybe? Some loose boards? I opened the bedroom door and checked the hallway. Nothing, just the silence again. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked slowly down the hall, flashlight in hand. The beam of light flicked across the walls, hitting the kitchen and the living room. Everything was still. That's when I saw it. On the floor, just outside the living room, a small puddle of something dark. At first, I thought it was just water from the snow I had tracked in earlier, but as I bent down to get a closer look, I realized what it was. It was blood. I stood there, frozen for a moment, unable to process what I was seeing. My mind raced. It didn't make sense. There was no way someone had been in here. The door had been locked. The windows were shut tight. I had checked everything myself. I crouched down, shining the light closer, but the blood was already starting to dry, leaving dark smears on the wooden floor. My stomach churned. This was no accident. Something had happened here, and I was the only one who could have caused it. I backed up slowly, my mind spinning. It was then that I realized the walls were not as quiet as they had been earlier. The creaking sounds were back, but they were louder now, almost like they were coming from above or beneath. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I walked over to the kitchen, and the sound grew louder. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. Something was in there, something I had not noticed before. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get out of there, but my feet were rooted to the floor. I needed to know what was happening. I grabbed the nearest heavy object I could find, a metal kettle, and slammed it against the floorboards. There was a loud crack, and the floor gave way beneath the force. What I saw was not what I had expected. A small, rotting wooden box. It was partially buried beneath the floor, sealed shut by years of dirt and dust. My heart stopped as I knelt down, prying the box free with trembling hands. The moment I opened it, the smell hit me. Sour and metallic, a pungent mixture of decay. Inside was a bundle of old, yellowed papers, wrapped in string. I knew better than to look further, but my hands moved on their own, unfolding the papers. They were photographs, old black and white pictures of people. People I didn't recognize. But the unsettling thing was the look in their eyes. Hollow, lifeless, like they had seen something they shouldn't. I didn't stay long enough to figure it out. My stomach twisted, and I felt a cold rush of fear surge through me. I backed away from the box, sealing it up again, and threw it into the corner of the room. I grabbed my things. I didn't care what was going on anymore. I needed to get out. I didn't look back as I ran to my car, my heart racing, my hands slick with sweat. The cabin receded into the dark forest behind me, and I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. Weeks later, I would hear rumors about disappearances near Riverbend. People had gone missing, some found in the woods, others not at all. The local authorities couldn't explain it. No one could, but I knew what I had found in that cabin, and I was never going back. It had been a long day, but the excitement I felt about finally reaching the cabin was enough to keep me going. I had planned this trip for weeks, a solo retreat to unwind after a stressful period at work. I was 27, living in a small city up north, and I needed a break from the constant rush. The cabin was located deep in the woods, away from everything, a place where I could clear my mind. I had been driving for what felt like forever, down narrow roads that seemed to disappear into the trees. There were no other cars around, just the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant call of a bird. The deeper I went, the more isolated everything seemed, and it felt like the world was shutting out all the noise of modern life. Finally, I turned onto a gravel road that led to the cabin. The trees seemed to form a canopy overhead, blocking out the last rays of the setting sun. I slowed down, navigating through the forest until I reached the cabin, hidden in a small clearing. It was exactly what I'd imagined, a rustic, weathered wooden cabin with a stone chimney and a porch that creaked when you stepped on it. It looked old, but well-maintained, tucked away from any sign of civilization. I parked the car, grabbed my backpack, and made my way inside. The door creaked open, and the smell of old pine wood and earth filled my nose. The interior was just as charming as I had hoped. It was simple, with a few pieces of furniture, a couch, a small table, and a stone fireplace. The walls were lined with wooden paneling, and the floors were made of thick, creaky boards. There were no frills, no modern luxuries, just the basics. It was perfect. I unpacked my things, settling in for what I hoped would be a peaceful few days of solitude. The cabin had no electricity, which was exactly what I wanted. There was a wood stove for heating, a small propane stove for cooking, and oil lamps to light the place at night. I knew it would be cold once the sun went down, but I was prepared. I started a fire in the stove, the flames crackling as the room began to warm. After a while, the sun had completely dipped below the horizon, and darkness took over. The cabin felt even more secluded now, with only the flickering light of the fire to keep the shadows at bay. The only sounds were the occasional snap of wood in the fire, the rustling of the wind outside, and the distant call of an owl. I had no particular plans for the evening, so I decided to just relax, enjoy the quiet, and read a book by the fire. But as the night went on, the silence began to feel heavy. The more I tried to read, the more I became aware of the stillness surrounding me. There were no noises outside, no other sounds, just the crackling fire. It felt unnatural, like the whole forest was holding its breath. Every now and then, I thought I heard a faint noise, something soft, but it was always followed by complete silence again. The hairs on the back of my neck began to prickle. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, wandering too close. Still, something about the way the silence enveloped the cabin made me uneasy. I decided to get up and close the windows, even though there was no real reason to think someone or something could get inside. The windows were old, with thick glass, and I could see the moonlight filtering through the trees outside. I made sure everything was locked and double-checked the door. There was a sense of security in the mundane actions, but as I sat back down by the fire, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The night went on, and I eventually fell asleep on the couch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The fire had burned down to a few glowing embers, casting soft, red shadows on the walls. I woke up suddenly, jolted from my sleep by a loud noise outside. Something had crashed in the woods. I shot upright, heart racing, listening intently. I could hear the wind picking up outside, rustling the leaves, but that sound had been accompanied by something heavier, a thud or the snap of branches. It was too close to be anything natural. I waited, holding my breath, as the sound faded into the distance. After a few moments, I stood up and cautiously moved toward the window. I peeked out but saw nothing in the darkness. The moonlight illuminated the clearing around the cabin, but the woods beyond were thick and impenetrable. Nothing seemed out of place. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear or a wild boar, wandering through the forest at night. The noise had been unsettling, but I had to remind myself that I was in the middle of nowhere, and it was normal for wildlife to make strange sounds. Still, I locked the door again, just in case, and went back to bed, pulling the blanket tightly around me. I had been shaken, but I was determined to get some sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of fresh pine and morning dew. The cabin was quiet again, and the sun had risen, casting a golden light through the trees. I stretched and made my way to the small kitchen area to start brewing some coffee. The events of the night still lingered in my mind, but the morning light helped push those thoughts aside. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was vast, with thick trees and a few small creeks running through the woods. The air was fresh, and the scent of pine filled my lungs with every breath. I found a small trail leading deeper into the forest and decided to follow it for a while. It was peaceful out there, with only the occasional bird or squirrel darting through the trees. I couldn't help but feel at ease, the anxiety of last night fading with each step. When I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, I found something strange. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it before I left, but now it was open, just a crack. My heart skipped a beat as I stepped forward cautiously, half expecting to see someone inside. But the cabin was empty, just as I had left it. I closed the door and locked it again, my mind racing. There was no reason for the door to have been opened. I hadn't seen anyone out in the woods, and there were no signs of forced entry. But the unsettling feeling was back. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched or that someone, or something, was out there. I decided to stay inside that night, making sure everything was locked and secured. I cooked a simple dinner, trying to distract myself from the anxiety creeping in. But as the night wore on, the silence again felt oppressive. The wind had picked up, howling outside the cabin. The fire in the stove crackled, but there was an underlying tension in the air. Every now and then, I would hear a faint creak from the floorboards or the sound of something scraping against the walls. I stood up from the couch, feeling the weight of the fear in my chest. I walked to the window once more, peering out into the dark. The wind swirled through the trees, making the shadows dance, but there was no one in sight. Nothing. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered, heavy and suffocating. I decided I couldn't stay another night in this place. I had made up my mind. There was something off about this cabin, something that I couldn't explain, and I wasn't going to stick around to figure it out. I gathered my things in a hurry, trying not to let the panic overwhelm me. The thought of driving back down that lonely gravel road made my heart race, but I knew I couldn't stay. The cabin had started to feel less like a retreat and more like a trap. With one final glance around the room, I stepped outside, locked the door behind me, and walked quickly to my car. The forest seemed even darker now, the trees looming over me like silent watchers. I got in the car and started the engine, my hands shaking. As I drove away from the cabin, I looked into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the distance. But all I saw was the dark, empty road. By the time I reached the main highway, the fear that had gripped me began to loosen. The cabin was behind me, the woods fading in the distance, the unsettling silence, the creaks and whispers of the night. None of it mattered anymore. I had made it out. Looking back, I still don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the isolation making everything seem more eerie than it actually was. But I'll never forget the feeling that something wasn't right. The silence was too loud, the forest too still. As I drove home, I realized that I had left something behind in that cabin. A sense of peace, perhaps, but more importantly, a lesson about trusting my instincts. I'd gone there looking for solitude and clarity, but in the end, I found something much deeper. The reminder that not everything is as it seems, and sometimes leaving is the only choice that makes sense. The wind was heavy that evening, thick and biting. It had started around noon, a light breeze turning into something more powerful as the day stretched on. By the time I reached the cabin, it felt as if the whole forest was holding its breath, the kind of silence that only exists in places far from civilization. That silence, punctuated only by the occasional gust of wind scraping against the tree trunks. I'd always been someone who loved the outdoors, the kind of person who found peace in isolation. So when I decided to spend the weekend alone in a small cabin just outside of Bear Valley, I wasn't thinking about the fact that I hadn't been in a cabin like this before. The cabin was old, a small wooden structure that looked like it had been standing for decades. It had a faded red paint job that clung to the wood as though it too was tired. The surrounding forest, thick with pine and birch trees, seemed to close in around it, offering little light through its dense branches. I parked my car at the foot of the long dirt driveway and grabbed my bags. The path to the cabin was not well maintained, which made sense given how few people came out this far. As I walked the narrow trail, each step seemed to sink a little more into the earth, the wet ground from yesterday's rain adding weight to my shoes. The wind carried a scent of pine needles and damp earth, but there was something else in the air, something that made me uneasy. A smell, faint but noticeable, like wet metal or something rusted. The cabin itself was surprisingly cozy once I stepped inside. It smelled of old wood and a faint hint of mildew. The fireplace was the focal point, its stone hearth dark and cold. The single window near the door showed nothing but the dense trees outside, and the small kitchen nook with its chipped tiles and old appliances had an air of abandonment. But it was quiet, and that was what I was looking for. The peace of being alone, away from the world for a little while. I didn't plan to do much that evening. Just a quiet dinner, maybe a book, and an early night. It wasn't until I started unpacking that I noticed the first odd thing. At the back of the cabin, in the corner behind a faded armchair, was a small door. The kind that was probably meant to be a closet or pantry, but there were no shelves inside. Just a dark space that felt unnaturally empty. I figured it must have been a storage room of some kind, but it was strange that it was so hidden, tucked away in a corner where no one would notice. After a few moments, I decided to ignore it. I had more pressing matters to attend to. I went about making myself dinner, a simple pasta dish that I could cook in the small kitchenette. The wind howled outside, the trees creaking in response. There was something oddly comforting about the sound of the wind, like the world outside was 1,000 miles away. The darkness came quickly, as it always does in the woods. The shadows crept across the floor of the cabin, growing longer as the light from my small lantern flickered. I felt the weight of the silence again, even as I ate. It wasn't normal. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was as though the world had stopped just for me, leaving the forest outside and the cabin within in a strange stasis. After dinner, I cleaned up quickly and then settled on the couch near the fireplace. I had a book with me, a worn paperback that I had brought along for the trip. I tried to focus on the words, but I found my mind wandering. It was hard to shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. The wind had picked up again, now stronger than before, and I could hear it pushing against the cabin, rattling the windows and door. Every so often, the house seemed to groan under the pressure. I thought it was just the wind, but there was something unsettling about the sound. It was when I stood up to fetch some water that I saw it again, the small door in the back of the cabin. It stood slightly ajar now. I hadn't opened it. In fact, I had made sure to check it when I first arrived, and it had been shut tight. But there it was, cracked open by maybe half an inch. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood frozen for a second, trying to make sense of it. It was probably nothing. Maybe the wind had somehow pushed it open, or maybe I had forgotten to close it all the way. I told myself that was all it was and decided to go over and shut it. But when I got closer, something felt off. I don't know how to explain it. It wasn't like I could see anything unusual. The air felt cooler around the door, like it was somehow pulling heat from the rest of the room. My fingers brushed against the frame, and for a split second, I felt something soft and warm, almost like a hand grazing mine. I jerked back, heart pounding. I told myself it was just my nerves. I'd been alone for too long, hadn't slept well the night before, and the isolation was starting to mess with my head. I closed the door quickly and locked it, then went back to the couch. I tried to distract myself with my book again, but the silence pressed on me more than before. Every creak of the cabin seemed magnified. Every gust of wind felt like something far more deliberate. The fire had almost gone out by now, and I knew I should probably tend to it, but I couldn't bring myself to get up. I don't know how much time passed. Maybe an hour, maybe more. I must have drifted into a light sleep because I was startled awake by the sound of something heavy thudding against the floor, coming from the direction of the small door. I froze. It was too loud to be the wind. It was as if something or someone had dropped something heavy inside. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no logical explanation for it, but I had a feeling deep in my gut that something was wrong. I stood up slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. My legs were shaky, but I forced myself to move toward the door, the only thing I could focus on. The air in the cabin felt thick, suffocating. The wind had died down and everything was still, too still. When I reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. I didn't want to open it. I knew I shouldn't, but my curiosity, combined with the gnawing feeling in my gut, made me twist the handle and push it open. The room beyond was dark, too dark to make out much, but I could feel the coolness of the air seeping out, the chill almost like a warning. I stepped inside, heart pounding. The space was small, with wooden beams overhead and dust that seemed to swirl in the faint light from the main cabin. But as I stepped deeper, something in the corner caught my eye. It was a shape, something huddled in the shadows, barely visible. I couldn't tell what it was at first, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized with a jolt that it was a bundle of old, tattered clothes lying on the floor in the corner of the room. My first thought was that someone had left them here long ago, but then I saw something else. On top of the clothes, a series of deep scratches in the wood. Not random, but deliberate. The marks were fresh. I didn't want to look closer, but I couldn't stop myself. As I took a step forward, I noticed something that sent a shiver down my spine. There were footprints, small, faint impressions in the dust, leading out of the corner and toward the door I had just opened. I was no longer alone. My stomach twisted into knots as the full weight of the situation hit me. I wasn't alone in the cabin, and I wasn't alone in the woods. I could hear a faint rustling sound behind me, barely audible, but enough to send me into a full panic. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there, only the empty, dark cabin. The air seemed to press in on me, the silence more suffocating now than before. I had to leave. I had to get out. I turned and ran to the front door, stumbling over the floorboards, heart racing. The door slammed open with a force I hadn't intended, and I burst outside into the cold night air. The moon was full, its pale light cutting through the trees. I didn't look back. I just ran, through the trees, over the rough terrain, not stopping until I reached the car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, but eventually, I got the engine to turn over. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I was hours away from that cabin, from Bear Valley, from whatever was hiding out there. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night, or if I ever want to, but I know one thing: that cabin was never meant to be my peace. I never thought I'd be spending the weekend at a remote cabin, far from civilization. But here I was, standing in front of it, staring up at the old wood structure surrounded by dense trees. It was mid-October, 2025. The air was crisp, and the ground had that damp, earthy smell of a fall day just after a light rain. The trees were shifting from vibrant green to shades of yellow and orange, their leaves covering the ground in a thick carpet. I'm Mark, 29 years old, from a small town just outside of Boston. I'm the type of guy who normally likes the city, crowded streets, a constant hum of noise. But my brother, Jake, who's always been the outdoorsy one, had been asking me to join him on a cabin trip for years. This time, I finally agreed. A weekend in a cabin seemed like it could be an escape from my usual routine. Something simple and quiet, away from the pressure of work. When I arrived, Jake was already there, unloading his gear from his old Jeep. He'd been to this cabin a few times before and told me it was secluded. No neighbors, just a peaceful spot to unwind. The cabin itself was weathered, with a few cracks in the walls, but sturdy. A small wood-burning stove sat next to the kitchen, and the windows were wide enough to let in the warmth of the sun in the day and provide a good view of the woods at night. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and pine. There was a small living room area with a couple of mismatched chairs, a thick, worn rug on the floor, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been used in years. The kitchen was simple: a gas stove, an old-fashioned sink, and a small fridge that hummed constantly. It didn't seem like much, but there was a certain charm to the place. Jake had already set up his sleeping bag in the corner of the living room, and I decided to claim the loft. It was small, but it had a good view through the narrow window that overlooked the forest. After unpacking my stuff, we went outside to sit on the porch. The quiet was overwhelming at first. I couldn't get over how still it was. The only sound was the rustling of the trees in the wind and the occasional chirp of a distant bird. "We'll be fine," Jake said, almost reading my thoughts. "No one comes out here, just the way I like it." That evening, we built a fire outside, sitting around it as the temperature dropped. The light from the fire flickered in the shadows of the trees, casting long, eerie shapes on the ground. We drank beers, ate some snacks, and talked about everything and nothing. As the night deepened, the forest seemed to grow quieter, like it was holding its breath. I don't know why, but I started feeling a little uneasy. It wasn't the forest itself. I've spent time in places like this before. It was something else. Maybe it was the isolation, the complete absence of other people, or the way the darkness felt almost thick. That night, as I lay in the loft, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I brushed it off as nerves, something that was bound to happen in a place like this. The wind outside had picked up, and the trees groaned and creaked, making the whole place feel like it was alive. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't the usual creaks or groans of the cabin settling. This was something different, something deliberate. It wasn't a squirrel or a deer. It was too heavy for that. My heart started to race as I strained to listen, the sound growing louder. It was like footsteps crunching in the leaves. I pulled the blanket over my head, telling myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear. But then I heard it again, a scraping noise, followed by what sounded like someone dragging something across the ground. My stomach knotted, and my mind raced through every possible scenario. I wasn't sure what to do. Could be a person out there, someone who'd wandered too far from the trail, or someone with bad intentions. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening to the sounds from outside, but they stopped as suddenly as they had started. The only sound now was the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional creak of the cabin. I couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, so I decided to stay awake, listening carefully for any more signs of movement. At sunrise, I got up and went outside. The air was cold, and a light fog hung over the forest. Everything seemed normal at first, no sign of anyone or anything unusual. But as I walked around the cabin, I noticed something odd. The dirt by the back door was disturbed, like someone had been walking around the perimeter of the cabin during the night. I knelt down, examining the ground, but there were no footprints, just the trampled earth. "Jake!" I called out, my voice shaky. "Hey, Jake, you awake?" He came out of the cabin, stretching. "What's up? Did you hear anything last night? Or see anyone?" I asked, my voice low. Jake gave me a puzzled look. "No, I didn't hear anything." "Why?" "I thought I heard someone outside," I said, still looking around. He shrugged, not taking it seriously. "Probably just an animal. You know how it gets out here." But I wasn't convinced. The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I felt. I wanted to leave, to drive back to town, but something kept me there. Jake was fine with everything, and he was right. Nothing had actually happened. Still, there was a sense of tension that I couldn't shake. We spent the day hiking through the woods. It wasn't far from the cabin, just a simple trail that wound through the trees and over a small creek. The fresh air and exercise helped clear my mind, and by the time we returned, the feeling of unease had started to fade. The sun was setting, and we started a fire outside again. The crackling of the flames and the warm glow were comforting, and I found myself finally relaxing. That night, I slept better than I had the previous night, despite the uneasiness that had plagued me. I woke up once or twice, listening to the wind, but there was no strange scraping sound, no heavy footsteps outside. Everything seemed peaceful. By morning, I was feeling more like myself, but when I went outside to get some fresh air, I noticed something strange. The back door had been left open. I was sure I had locked it the night before. I walked over to it, my heart beating faster now. I checked the inside of the cabin. Nothing appeared out of place, but there was a definite sense that something was wrong. I asked Jake if he'd gone outside, but he said no. No one else had been there. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that someone had been around the cabin. Someone who knew the area and had been watching us. It wasn't until we packed up to leave that I found something that made my blood run cold. As I was loading the last of my gear into the car, I found a small, weathered knife under one of the steps leading up to the porch. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't Jake's. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of what had happened. Maybe it was an animal, maybe it was someone just passing through. But I knew one thing: someone had been out there. We left the cabin that afternoon, and I haven't been back since. But I'll never forget that feeling, the sense that we weren't as alone as we thought. It was the kind of experience that stays with you, gnawing at the back of your mind long after you've left the place behind. The weather had been bad for days, pouring rain without any sign of letting up. The kind of downpour that made everything dark, heavy, and oppressive. It was late October when I decided to take a trip to the cabin I'd inherited from my uncle. A small, secluded place in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina, tucked away in the woods. I hadn't been there in years, not since I was a kid. Back then, it was a place for family reunions and summer vacations, but now, as a 29-year-old, I figured it would be a good escape from the busy pace of everyday life. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky a thick sheet of gray. The rain made the road slick, and the car tires kicked up mud as I drove down the narrow, dirt road leading to the cabin. The trees were so dense here, the kind that seemed to stretch on forever. The cabin itself was nestled in a small clearing, barely visible from the road. The old wooden structure looked tired and weathered, but it was still sturdy enough. The paint was peeling, the roof was covered in moss, and the chimney stood tall against the dreary backdrop of trees. I grabbed my bags from the trunk of the car and made my way to the door, trying to avoid the puddles that had formed on the ground. The air felt thick with moisture, and I was glad to finally get inside and out of the rain. The interior smelled musty, like old wood and mildew, but it was cozy. A small stone fireplace sat against the far wall, and a large window overlooked the woods outside. The furniture was old but comfortable. A couple of chairs, a wooden table, and a couch with faded cushions. The place had a quiet charm to it, though it was a little dusty from being vacant for so long. I set my things down and took a moment to breathe in the quiet. It was so peaceful out here, far from the noise and chaos of the city. I started a fire in the hearth, watching the flames crackle as the heat began to warm the room. The sound of the rain hitting the roof was rhythmic, almost soothing, as I settled in for the evening. I was alone, of course. I hadn't invited anyone. A retreat into solitude, a time to reflect, to disconnect. The idea of being alone in such a remote place was appealing, even if a little eerie. I'd always been a bit on edge when I stayed here, especially at night. There was something about the silence, the isolation, that made the mind wander. The dark woods surrounding the cabin seemed endless, and in the past, I'd always had the nagging feeling that something was out there, something just beyond the trees. The rain continued to fall in sheets as the evening wore on, and I lost track of time, my eyes heavy from the warmth of the fire. It was around midnight when I woke up from an accidental nap. The fire had burned down to embers, and the room was much colder than before. I stood up and tossed another log onto the fire, watching as it flared up, casting long shadows across the walls. I didn't want to go to bed just yet. The silence was unnerving. I kept hearing little creaks and groans from the cabin, the house settling into the night. The wind howled outside, making the trees shake. But there was something else, something subtle, like a distant thud or scrape against the cabin. My mind was quick to dismiss it as the storm, the branches hitting the roof or the side of the house, but I couldn't help but listen closer. The sound came again, a sharp scrape, then another. I froze. It wasn't the wind. This sound was deliberate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen counter and slowly moved toward the door. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I winced at every step. I peered through the window but saw nothing, just the storm outside and the dark shape of the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there. I stood there for a moment, gathering the courage to open the door. But then I heard it again, a soft scraping sound, like nails on wood, followed by a rustle, as though something was moving around the porch. I knew I was alone. I had been since I arrived, and the thought of anyone else being out there in such a remote place made my heart race. It had to be an animal, I thought, probably a raccoon or some other critter. I told myself not to be paranoid, but the doubt lingered. I opened the door slowly, shining the flashlight onto the porch. There was nothing there. The rain fell in sheets, and the only sound was the rustling of the trees. I exhaled, relieved, but as I turned to close the door, I noticed something odd. A small, wet footprint in the mud just outside the threshold. It was clear, fresh, and unmistakable. I stared at it for a moment. It wasn't the print of an animal. It was too human. I quickly slammed the door shut and locked it. My heart was pounding in my chest. I backed away from the door, trying to think. Who could it have been? There was no way anyone could have come this far out in the storm. I was miles from the nearest neighbor. I grabbed the phone from the table, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, far from any cell towers. I checked the windows, looking out into the dark woods. But all I could see was the rain, pouring down in sheets, and the trees swaying in the wind. I was still on edge, the unsettling feeling in my gut growing. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, though I wasn't sure what good it would do me. I wasn't really afraid of a person, not exactly, but the thought of something or someone being out there so close to the cabin was making my mind race. What if they were watching me? What if they were waiting for the right moment to come in? The night dragged on. Every little noise made me jump. I kept hearing strange sounds from outside, but each time I checked, there was nothing there. I thought about barricading the doors and windows, but it seemed silly, almost paranoid. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't shake the sense of danger. Around 2 a.m., I finally gave in to exhaustion and decided to go to bed. I pulled the covers over my head and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the faintest sound, scraping, tapping, rustling. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. It sounded close, but maybe it was just the wind. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up to the sound of something thumping against the door. My heart jumped into my throat, and I sat up in bed, my breath shallow. The storm had let up, but the silence now was even worse, amplifying every small sound. I grabbed the flashlight and crept toward the door, my fingers gripping the handle. I swung it open quickly, shining the light around the porch again. There was nothing, no one, just the remnants of the storm, wet ground, damp air, and the smell of pine. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, trying to calm myself down. It had to be my nerves. I was alone out here in the middle of nowhere. The idea of anyone being so close of being watched was irrational. But that's when I noticed something else. The footprint was gone. It wasn't there anymore. I checked the ground, the porch, but there was nothing. It was as if it had never been there at all. A wave of confusion washed over me. My mind was playing tricks, or so I tried to convince myself. But deep down, I knew I hadn't imagined it. I stayed up the rest of the night, watching the door and keeping my eyes on every little movement outside. But nothing else happened. No more footsteps, no more rustling. By morning, the rain had stopped and the sky had cleared. The world outside was quiet, peaceful, as if nothing had ever happened. I didn't stay another night. I packed up and left that morning, the sight of the cabin growing smaller in my rearview mirror. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I wasn't sure how to explain it. Maybe I'd been paranoid. Maybe it was all just in my head. But the thing that stayed with me wasn't the fear. It was the feeling of being watched, of something unseen moving just out of sight. And as I drove away, I couldn't shake the thought that someone had been out there. Maybe they were still out there,